Night falls slowly over a stone square that has forgotten its name. The rain has just ended, leaving the cobblestones slick and glistening like old glass. Torches hiss in iron brackets along the walls, their smoke rising into the chill. People gather in silence, faces half hidden beneath wool hoods, waiting for something both terrible and divine. In the faint orange light, the world looks suspended between heaven and earth, between faith and fear. In this age, justice does not belong to men. It breathes through the church, through kings who claim their crowns by grace, through laws carved in the likeness of Scripture. Every wrong is not simply against another soul, but against the order of creation itself. A thief steals from God's harmony, a liar corrupts the purity of truth, a heretic stains eternity. To punish such acts is not cruelty, it is restoration. The people believe this as firmly as they believe in sunrise. Punishment is prayer made visible. When the lash cracks, it is not a sound of vengeance but of cleansing. The body must pay for what the spirit has disturbed. There is comfort in that certainty, strange as it seems now. The villagers who watch the condemned kneel in the square do not see savagery. They see balance being restored. The world, for a moment, feels right again. Imagine living beneath that certainty. Imagine believing that every act of pain bends the universe back toward perfection. The priest lifts his hand, not in rage but in ritual, and the crowd bows its heads. Somewhere in the silence, the question flickers. What if justice was not about fairness, but about saving your soul through pain? The Middle Ages did not invent cruelty, they sanctified it. They wrapped suffering in ritual and offered it to heaven. Every punishment carried a meaning as precise as a psalm. The stocks humbled pride. The scourge washed away deceit. Fire purified the unrepentant. Even the gallows reached toward the sky, as though returning the sinner to the element that would judge him. There was order in agony, symmetry in despair. For those who lived then, mercy was not gentle. It was distance from eternal torment, not escape from earthly pain. The condemned might thank their executioner for shortening the path through purgatory. To suffer here was to avoid something worse beyond. Fear kept the soul in line when reason could not. That fear was not an emotion. It was architecture. It built cities, laws, and habits of obedience that shaped every breath. The world before mercy moved according to rhythm, not compassion. Seasons of planting and reaping, of confession and punishment, all echoed the same lesson. There is no sin without cost. The idea soothed as much as it terrified. Even the poorest peasant could feel protected by this order. If justice was divine, then his own misery had meaning. Each blow upon another man's back whispered that God still watched, still cared enough to correct. Yet beneath that calm certainty, another truth murmured. Some began to notice how easily holiness could disguise hunger for power. A noble could brand his enemy a heretic. A priest could call dissent a sin. Pain, once sacred, could become spectacle. And still the crowds came, drawn by the promise of witnessing salvation through another's suffering. The square filled again and again, as though the people feared what silence might reveal. To stand there was to feel the pulse of an age, smoke curling upward, voices chanting, a body trembling on its knees. This was more than punishment, it was communion. Everyone participated, the ruler affirming authority, the priest blessing the act, the crowd absorbing the moral lesson. Each role locked into place like stones in a cathedral wall. Remove one, and the whole structure might crumble. That is why mercy was dangerous. Mercy questioned the design. To forgive was to claim that pain was not required, that the balance could be restored without blood. Such a thought trembled at the edge of blasphemy. And so the world guarded its rituals fiercely, building layer upon layer of fear to keep compassion from entering. The torches, the drums, the public confessions, all reminders that salvation demanded spectacle. Still, even in this order of fire and faith, humanity whispered through. A mother wept, though she dared not speak. An apprentice blacksmith turned his face away. Somewhere, a monk copied a verse about love, while hearing screams from the courtyard below. Contradiction lived quietly beside devotion. It is that tension, the coexistence of prayer and cruelty, that gives the medieval world its haunting stillness. Centuries later, we look back and see brutality. They looked up and saw the face of God. Both views are true, separated by the slow drift of belief. The world before mercy teaches that justice is never neutral, it always mirrors what a people worship. And in that mirror, we glimpse not monsters, but reflections of our own need for order, meaning, and control. The torches burn lower now. The crowd begins to scatter, their footsteps fading into alleys slick with rain. The condemned is gone, the square empty once more. Yet the echo remains a rhythm between guilt and grace that still beats inside the stories we tell about right and wrong. As the night deepens, the narrator's voice softens. The world before mercy has spoken. Next, we will step beyond the square, into the places where fear became ceremony, where punishment was not only endured but performed, until pain itself turned into ritual. Morning breaks pale and uncertain, the colour of old parchment. The town square, still damp from the previous night's rain, stirs awake beneath the toll of distant bells. They ring slowly, evenly, not in alarm but in ritual, the sound that tells everyone their part in the day's performance. From narrow streets and crooked doorways, people emerge. Some carry baskets, others their children, some only curiosity. They know what will happen, and yet they come as though drawn by gravity. In the medieval world, pain was never private. It belonged to everyone, a shared act of witnessing that defined the boundary between order and chaos. The condemned would be brought from the cell just before dawn, escorted by monks and soldiers, wrapped in rough cloth that smelled of tallow and fear. Their steps echoed against the stones as though rehearsed. The townsfolk waited with a reverence usually reserved for holy days. In a sense, this was one. They called it justice. We might call it theatre. The air trembles with that paradox, sacred cruelty, divine spectacle. The punishment is not simply to destroy but to display. The crowd must see, must feel the presence of law made flesh. Every gesture has meaning. The rope tied at a precise height, the kneeling position of the condemned, the rhythm of the drum that announces the sentence all serve to turn punishment into ceremony. In this strange choreography, the body becomes the stage on which the soul is tested. The priest begins to chant. His voice, steady and monotonous, rolls over the square like fog. He recites psalms of repentance, calling upon the angels to witness the purification of sin. To the crowd, his voice is both comfort and warning. Children cling to their mothers, not out of fear but fascination. They are watching belief take shape. Somewhere deep in their minds, a lesson takes root. Obedience is safety, disobedience is fire. The executioner stands apart, hooded, silent, neither villain nor hero. In the eyes of the people, he is a necessary vessel, an earthly hand guided by divine will. He does not act out of hatred. He performs a duty. And like any actor, he must play his role perfectly. To falter would be to disrupt the fragile balance between justice and chaos. As the ritual unfolds, time itself seems to stretch. Each movement feels deliberate. The turning of the key, the raising of the hand, the drawn breath before the first strike. The crowd leans forward as though watching a sacred mystery. When the first blow lands, a sound ripples through them, not outrage, not pity, but awe. It is the sound of belief reinforcing itself. Pain becomes communication. Each cry, each gasp, each tremor of flesh translates into meaning. To the onlookers, it is a sermon in motion. The condemned's suffering confirms what they have been taught since birth, that sin is real, that authority is unshakable. That order depends on visible fear. In this way, the ritual binds them together. It transforms fear into unity, doubt into devotion. We might imagine horror, but they felt grace. For them, these scenes were not acts of darkness but of light, proof that justice still ruled the world. The flames, the wheel, the scaffold were reminders that heaven still watched. Without them, life would have felt dangerously unmoored. In the absence of visible punishment, sin might grow like a weed. The ceremony was the weeding of souls. If we step closer, we begin to notice the details that make this ritual so strangely beautiful. The arrangement of the instruments, often in geometric alignment, reflected the sacred numbers of Scripture, 3 for the Trinity, 7 for divine completion, 12 for the apostles. Even pain was ordered according to heaven's logic. The builders of these devices did not see themselves as inventors of suffering, but as interpreters of divine proportion. Consider the pillory, simple yet symbolic. The condemned's head and hands, locked in wood, formed a living cruciform, a parody of salvation. The crowd could gaze upon it and remember both Christ's suffering and their own safety from it. The wheel, turning endlessly, mirrored the cycle of sin and repentance. The whip's cords, woven with knots, echoed the rosary, each strike a bead of confession. Nothing was random. The square itself became a kind of open-air cathedral. The architecture of punishment was designed to teach. There were stations, just as there are in the way of the cross. The procession, the confession, the execution, the ashes. The spectators stood where pews might be, and the executioner's platform served as altar. Instead of bread and wine, they received the sight of retribution. It was a grim communion, but communion nonetheless. In this world, morality and spectacle were inseparable. The mind that could design a cathedral could also design a scaffold. Both sought the same thing, to make belief tangible. A stained glass window turned light into scripture. A public execution turned sin into sight. Both told stories. Both kept the world aligned with heaven. To the listener of our time, such scenes may seem grotesque, but to the medieval heart they were necessary. The ceremony did not simply punish, it performed. It allowed the people to see justice enacted, to feel it ripple through their bones. It was theatre that reminded them of their place in creation. Even those who feared it most could not look away. When the punishment reached its end, when the condemned fell silent or the final spark of fire faded, the crowd often knelt. They did not cheer. They prayed. The air filled with murmured Latin and the low hum of psalms. The ritual concluded not with victory but with reflection. Sin had been burned away, and for a brief moment the town believed itself pure. But purity is fragile. By evening, gossip would return, envy would grow, and fear would creep back into the edges of thought. The cycle demanded renewal. Another trial, another confession, another ceremony. The wheel of justice never stopped turning. Each act of punishment ensured that the next would come. Historians call this cruelty. Philosophers call it control. Yet there is something deeper beneath both. The ritual of pain was, in a strange way, an art of reassurance. It told people that suffering had purpose. In a world where disease struck without warning, where hunger and war hovered like shadows, at least punishment was predictable. It had rules, structure, meaning. To witness it was to feel the world make sense again. And perhaps that is why beauty lingers in the memory of such terror. There is symmetry in the way faith and fear intertwine. The human mind craves pattern, even in cruelty. It wants to believe that agony serves a higher end, that the cries in the square reach some listening heaven. The medieval soul lived in that paradox, loving the divine and fearing its methods. Their ceremonies of punishment were attempts to reconcile the two, to make sense of a God who ruled through both mercy and flame. Every execution was an unanswered prayer, repeated until belief itself became numb. Sometimes, the condemned became part of the myth. Their stories spread like whispers. The thief who smiled at his execution, the heretic who sang as the fire rose, the witch who cursed her judges only to see a storm break moments later. The people carried these tales home like relics, blending truth and imagination until history became legend. Through them, punishment gained a second life, not as deterrent, but as memory. There is a quiet, eerie poetry in that. Long after the torches were extinguished, the ritual continued inside those who watched. Their dreams replayed the scene in softer tones, their prayers tangled with guilt and awe. The ceremony had done its work. It had planted itself in the human psyche. What fascinates us today is not the blood or the tools, but the choreography. How so many could move in harmony under belief so absolute. The same instinct that builds civilizations can also build scaffolds. The same devotion that paints saints on church walls can burn those accused of sin beneath them. Civilization and cruelty, art and agony, twins born of the same desire to give meaning to fear. And as the centuries passed, the performance changed costumes but not its soul. The square became the courtroom, the executioner became the judge, the crowd became the public. We learned to whisper punishment instead of shout it, yet the ritual remains. We still gather, in headlines and comment threads, to witness the fall of others. We still feel that secret thrill of moral cleansing. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of the medieval square, not the tools of torture, but the comfort of believing punishment restores balance. Beneath every act of justice lies a craving to see wrong turned visible, sin turned to lesson. The theatre continues, only its scenery shifts. The last bell of the day tolls again. The crowd disperses as shadows lengthen across the square. Somewhere, a child hums the melody of the priest's chant, not knowing what it means. The executioner wipes his hands and folds the rope carefully, as though putting away sacred objects. The smell of smoke lingers, mingling with bread from the nearby bakery. Life resumes its gentle rhythm, as if nothing extraordinary occurred. But something always remains an invisible thread, connecting all who witness the ritual. It binds them to one another, to their fear, to their faith. That thread stretches through time, delicate but unbroken. We can still feel it when we look at the relics left behind, the iron cuffs, the sketches in monastery margins, the accounts written by trembling scribes. Each artifact hums with the same quiet truth that pain, once ritualized, never entirely fades. And so the story deepens. The world has learned to hide its ceremonies, but not to abandon them. As we leave the square, the air feels heavier, filled with memory. Behind us, the torches flicker out one by one, their smoke twisting like script into the sky. Ahead lies another mystery, the birth of the instruments themselves, where belief took shape in iron and wood, and faith learned to speak through machines of agony. Before the sun rises, the forge is already alive. Inside the dim workshop, sparks bloom and fade like tiny stars, and the smell of smoke mingles with oil and sweat. The blacksmith stands before the anvil, hammer raised, shaping more than metal. He shapes belief. Each strike echoes through the still morning as though announcing a prayer no one dares to speak aloud. In this age, before machines, pain itself is engineered. To understand medieval punishment, we must first understand its makers, the craftsmen who spoke the language of iron. They were neither priests nor scholars, yet their work obeyed both scripture and geometry. They measured suffering in degrees of leverage, angles of restraint, precision of pressure. The rack stretched, not in chaos but in symmetry. Its gears turned like the wheels of a celestial diagram, each tooth aligned to divine proportion. To build such a thing was not an act of sadism, but of devotion. The blacksmith's forge was a sanctuary of contradictions, holy symbols carved into walls beside tools of torment. A crucifix above the doorway, a cauldron of molten iron glowing beneath. When the bellows sighed, it sounded almost like breathing, as if the workshop itself lived and listened. Every sound carried meaning, the clang of the hammer, the hiss of quenched metal, the steady rhythm of creation. Here, faith and fire became indistinguishable. The rack was perhaps the purest expression of that devotion. To stretch the body was to imitate the cosmos expanding under divine order. The victim's arms drawn wide, their body elongated, mirrored Christ upon the cross, a physical geometry of atonement. The blacksmith built it with care, ensuring the wood did not splinter too early, that the iron teeth aligned perfectly so the sound of turning was clean and even. In those details lay reverence. The device had to work flawlessly, because imperfection in pain was considered disorder, a flaw in the moral fabric of the world. Beside the rack stood the wheel, a quieter creation but no less meaningful. Its design borrowed from the ancient symbol of fortune, the ever-turning circle of destiny. Bound to it, a body became part of that eternal rotation. The iron rim gleamed under torchlight, a reminder that fate, once set in motion, could not be stopped. The blacksmith traced, each spoke with chalk before shaping it, marking numbers sacred to his faith. 12 spokes for the apostles, perhaps, or 7 for divine completeness. Nothing in iron was random. Every curve obeyed a reason older than mercy. Then came the chair, the iron seat, as it was called in whispers. Its surface, studded with spikes, resembled the armor of a saint twisted into inversion. The craftsman designed it not only for pain but for poise. The condemned must appear seated in dignity, as if still possessing a fragment of authority while agony bloomed beneath. In that posture lay symbolism. Pride transfixed, power humbled. The blacksmith did not see horror, he saw lesson. The chair taught that every throne could turn into judgment. These creations were more than tools, they were texts written in metal. Each hinge, latch, and rivet spelled out a theology of order. The blacksmith did not write with ink, he wrote with heat and repetition. His script was the ringing of steel, his punctuation, the cooling hiss that sealed meaning into form. When finished, he would run his hand along the cooled surface, reading it through touch, ensuring its balance. The harmony of function and belief mattered as much as the suffering it would later produce. It is tempting to imagine these men as monsters, but they were products of conviction. They believed they served both crown and heaven. Many began their craft forging swords for soldiers, bells for chapels, hinges for cathedrals. When asked to create instruments of punishment, they saw no contradiction. To them, the same hands that built gates of sanctuaries could also build gates of torment, for both protected the soul. A world governed by divine order required visible boundaries, and iron was the language that made those boundaries eternal. Sometimes, before delivering a finished device, the blacksmith would bless it. He would dip his fingers in water, trace a cross upon the metal, whispering that it served justice and not wrath. In his mind, this act transformed an object of cruelty into an instrument of correction. The ritual soothed conscience, turning craft into liturgy. Whether the blessing changed anything is another matter, but belief does not need proof, only repetition. Iron, in those centuries, was more than substance. It was symbol. It represented permanence, the incorruptible heart of the earth. Stone could crumble, wood could rot, but iron endured. It carried weight, authority, inevitability. The blacksmith's creations mirrored the era's theology. Unbending law, eternal consequence. Even the glint of polished metal under torchlight suggested the gleam of divine watchfulness. To touch it was to feel the chill of God's will made tangible. Listen closely, and you can almost hear the rhythm of their world, the steady pounding of hammers echoing across valleys, the low rumble of forges breathing smoke into grey skies. In that rhythm, towns found reassurance. As long as the forge burned, justice lived. The clang of metal was the heartbeat of order. And when that sound ceased, when iron cooled, silence itself became unsettling, as though morality had paused to take breath. Every generation refined the language. A new lock here, a sharper gear there. Designs passed quietly from one smith to another, handwritten notes folded into prayer books, sketches hidden behind altar panels. The craft evolved in shadows. The tools of punishment became as intricate as jewelry, as precise as instruments of music. It was not the cruelty that fascinated their makers, but the perfection of control, the ability to translate abstract sin into measurable strain. The artistry of these devices has outlived their use. In museums today, under glass and soft light, they rest like relics of a lost faith. Tourists whisper before them, unsure whether to feel horror or admiration. The symmetry still captivates, the flawless joinery, the balanced curves. What they see is craftsmanship. What they sense is conviction. Iron remembers the hands that made it. It carries the fingerprints of prayer and guilt alike. To gaze upon those relics is to glimpse a civilization that sought salvation through precision. The same Europe that painted Madonnas and carved cathedrals also tuned the gears of the rack with equal devotion. There was no boundary between beauty and fear, between artistry and punishment. Both belonged to the same pursuit, the desire to make the invisible visible, to give moral law a body. And perhaps that is the lasting enigma of the forge. It was not built on hatred, but on hope, the hope that suffering, properly designed, could heal the world. The blacksmith's fire was the world's conscience, burning bright enough to melt sin into obedience. Yet even then, a quieter truth flickered beneath the hammer's rhythm, that every act of creation contains its opposite. The same flame that tempers a blade also devours it. The same skill that builds protection builds pain. As twilight falls over the workshop, the blacksmith sets down his hammer. The forge cools, whispering smoke into the evening air. He wipes the soot from his face and kneels for a brief prayer, his hands trembling from the day's labour. Tomorrow he will shape more iron, perhaps a chain, perhaps a chalice. To him, both are vessels of faith. The line between sacred and profane remains invisible, drawn only by intention. Outside, the church bells begin to ring again, the same rhythm that guided the rituals of punishment in the square. Their sound merges with the fading echo of the hammer, one voice answering another. Faith speaks in many tongues, and among them, none was more enduring than the language of iron. The narrator's voice softens as the forge fades into memory. The listener can still feel the warmth, the faint sting of smoke, the shimmer of metal cooling in the dark. Having seen the artistry of punishment, we now turn to the belief that sustained it, to the theology that whispered meaning into every strike. and the minds that called pain divine. The bells toll softly across the valley, their echoes climbing through mist toward the vaulted heavens. Inside the church, candles flicker like living thoughts, trembling in rhythm with whispered prayers. Stone absorbs the sound of devotion, the sighs, the murmurs, the confessions offered in dim alcoves. Here, pain is not merely endured, it is sanctified. To hurt was to heal, and to suffer was to be seen by God. This belief flowed through the veins of medieval faith like blood through a body. The Church taught that sin was not a stain to be erased, but a wound to be cleansed. Salvation required action, not comfort. Each blow of hardship, each sickness, each self-inflicted scar carried the promise of redemption. In the eyes of the faithful, suffering was not failure but participation, the soul's way of echoing the passion of Christ. To hurt was to resemble the divine. Confession was the first step, but not the end. The act of admitting one's sins opened the door. Pain was the passage through it. Some came to priests not asking for forgiveness, but for penance severe enough to feel forgiveness take root in flesh. They believed that only through agony could grace be proven real. The lash, the fast, the long pilgrimage all were languages of sincerity. Without suffering, the apology was incomplete. The monasteries became quiet laboratories of this theology. In their stone cells, monks practiced mortification disciplines designed to humble the body so the spirit might ascend. A cord worn beneath the robe, biting into skin, knees bruised from prayer on cold floors, sleep denied, food withheld, silence stretched across years. These were not punishments but offerings. Each act whispered a message to heaven. I remember what I owe. The world outside mirrored this inner ritual. A noble might build a chapel to atone for cruelty. A soldier might carry wounds as penance for bloodshed. Queens founded hospitals. Kings funded crusades, not only for glory but for cleansing. The medieval conscience was a restless thing, forever seeking to balance sin with sacrifice. Pain was the currency that paid the debt of existence. Yet beneath the chants and incense lay a deeper mystery, one that shimmered between fear and faith. If pain could purify, could it also elevate? Could suffering become a bridge between earth and the divine? The saints seemed to answer yes. Hagiographies, the lives of saints filled the minds of the faithful with luminous examples. There was St. Catherine, who bore the invisible wounds of her devotion. St. Francis, who welcomed pain as companionship. St. Margaret, who smiled through torment, as if each flame were a kiss. These stories did not frighten believers. They invited them. They suggested that holiness was measured not by serenity, but by endurance. To suffer beautifully was to mirror heaven's patience. For rulers, this theology offered both comfort and power. A world built on divine suffering justified authority. If God's Son endured punishment for humanity's sins, then kings might claim the right to punish in God's name. Pain became an extension of order, its presence proof of a moral structure beneath chaos. Executions and wars could be seen as sacraments of purification, harsh, yes, but holy. In this way, theology bled into politics, and cruelty found sanctuary beneath the cross. But faith is rarely static. Over time, the practice of pain deepened into paradox. Some believers began to chase it, to crave the nearness of God found only in agony. Pilgrims walked barefoot over mountains of stone. Hermits lay on beds of thorns. Flagellants marched through villages, striking themselves with cords until the streets turned red. To outsiders, these acts seemed madness. To participants, they were revelations, proof that the boundary between flesh and spirit could be broken through devotion. They called it imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ. Not merely to follow his teachings, but to relive his suffering. Each wound was a translation of Scripture into the language of the body. When the whip tore flesh, it wrote the gospel in scar. The body became a manuscript of salvation, every mark a verse of faith. In this worldview, even illness carried sacred potential. A fever could be seen as cleansing fire, a plague as collective penance. The suffering of the many was interpreted as divine communication, punishment, warning, or test. The Church urged the faithful to accept pain with humility, not resistance. To rebel against suffering was to question God's will. The harder the life, the deeper the lesson. Yet even in this acceptance, there was unease. What of those who suffered without sin? What of children, of the innocent? The question flickered in the sermons of thoughtful priests, in the private doubts of scholars who dared not speak too loudly. Some reasoned that earthly pain must balance unseen joy, that heaven would one day justify the ledger. Others suspected that humanity, not God, had woven the logic of cruelty into faith itself. Still, the rituals continued. In dim cathedrals, confessionals filled with trembling voices. People named their wrongs in hushed tones, awaiting penance as one might await healing. The priest listened, then prescribed a number of prayers, a fast, a scourging, a pilgrimage. The penitent left relieved, not because the punishment would hurt, but because it would restore equilibrium. Pain meant progress. Even art absorbed this theology. Pain was painted into halos, carved into marble saints whose faces glowed with serene suffering. In their stillness, they seemed to whisper that agony, when accepted, could become beauty. That message endured longer than any sermon. Through centuries, the belief persisted that pain could cleanse not only of sin, but of doubt, of weakness, of distance from God. It offered meaning where chaos reigned. A child's death could be seen as part of divine plan, a famine as lesson, a personal tragedy as refinement of the soul. For a people who lived close to hunger and war, such belief was not cruelty, it was survival. Meaning transformed despair into devotion. But meaning has shadows. As faith shaped suffering, suffering shaped faith. The church that preached compassion also preserved its power through fear. Those who controlled the definition of sin controlled the access to forgiveness. And forgiveness, when sold through pain, became a form of currency. The whip and the relic, the indulgence and the confession, all part of the same moral economy. Still, it would be wrong to see only manipulation. Many truly believed. The penitent flagellant felt peace in his wounds. The monk who fasted to delirium found visions of light. Pain opened doors no comfort could. In the ache of the body, they felt eternity breathing close. Perhaps that is why this theology refuses to vanish. Even now, the idea lingers in subtler forms in our language of effort, of struggle, of worthiness. We say that success requires sacrifice, that strength is born from pain. We admire endurance as virtue, equating exhaustion with moral weight. Somewhere deep beneath modern thought, the old belief stirs, that to suffer is to be purified, that pain reveals truth. The medieval world did not invent this longing. It inherited it from ancient Stoics, from desert prophets, from the earliest myths where gods died and rose again through suffering. The church simply codified it, wrapped it in ritual and song. And though centuries have passed, the logic endures like iron buried beneath soil, unseen but uncorroded. To hurt was to heal. To suffer was to be seen. These words drift through time like incense, faint but persistent. They haunt hospitals and battlefields, penitentiaries and gymnasiums, places where pain still carries the scent of purpose. We tell ourselves we are freer now, enlightened, humane. Yet we still glorify endurance, still romanticize struggle, still whisper that redemption must cost something. So the question remains, whispered softly at the end of this reflection, did humanity ever stop believing that punishment saves us? Or have we merely traded the whip for the weight of guilt, the scaffold for the mirror? The bells begin again, faint but steady, calling across centuries. Their sound fades into the darkness below toward the chambers, where faith's symbols hardened into instruments, and belief learned to speak not in words, but in iron. Beneath the stone foundations of a fortress, the air grows thick and still. The faint drip of water echoes like a heartbeat in the dark. A single candle burns near the entrance, its flame swaying against a wall blackened by years of smoke. This is not the chaos of cruelty. It is the geometry of obedience, a place where silence has been trained to listen. They believed they were not torturers, but instruments of God. In these chambers, order ruled even pain. The walls were measured, the tables aligned, the ropes coiled with precision. Every tool had its appointed place, every act its sequence. To an outsider, the dungeon was horror. To its architects, it was harmony. Here, suffering became a system, one designed to preserve the world's fragile balance between sin and salvation. The Inquisition did not see itself as darkness, but as light brought into shadowed corners. Its inquisitors were scholars of the soul, men who sought confession not for cruelty's sake, but to cleanse error from existence. The dungeon was their classroom, the condemned, their reluctant pupils. Through pain, they believed, truth would rise to the surface like air from deep water. To lie under torment was to resist divine correction. To confess was to be reborn in honesty. The executioner, too, lived by a strange code of order. He was not a sadist, but a servant sworn to obey law, not appetite. He took no joy in screams. He avoided drink before duty. He sharpened his blade in silence as though preparing for prayer. When he performed his task, he did so with care. Precision, not passion, was his virtue. His world was one of duty stripped bare of emotion. To hesitate was sin, for hesitation implied doubt, and doubt was the crack through which mercy might enter. What kind of soul could live this way? Perhaps one that learned to see pain not as harm, but as purification. The architect of suffering believed he built a bridge between justice and redemption. The inquisitor asked not how much a man could bear, but how close he could bring him to the moment of truth. The executioner asked not whether the condemned deserved mercy, but whether mercy could undo divine balance. Each lived within a logic that seemed airtight, reinforced by scripture and authority. And yet, even among them, shadows stirred. Some spoke of nights haunted by the faces of the condemned. Some dreamt of the voices that echoed through stone corridors long after the torches were extinguished. One chronicler wrote that the purest inquisitor was the one who prayed hardest for forgiveness, not for those he punished, but for himself. Faith, he said, was the only barrier between order and madness. In the quiet of these dungeons, pain was never random. It followed rhythm. Questions were asked in repetition, pauses measured like musical rests. The inquisitor watched not for words, but for tremors. The slight hesitation, the shifting breath that betrayed the moment truth cracked open. They recorded confessions in calm script, the handwriting neat, the sentences formal. In their minds, the words they wrote down were not forced. They were revealed. Above them, the world moved in daylight markets, weddings, feasts. But down here, beneath cathedrals and castles, another world thrived, disciplined, methodical, hidden. Its architects spoke in whispers, obeyed with precision, and prayed before every act, not to justify themselves, but to align their will with heaven's. Before the turning of a rack, a prayer might be said for strength, not pity. May the truth be known, they whispered, and may the soul be cleansed. It is easy now to see them as monsters. Yet what if we saw them as believers? Faith can turn cruelty into calling, obedience into absolution. The inquisitor who tightened the ropes may have believed he was saving a soul from eternal damnation. The executioner who lifted his blade may have thought himself merciful, ending a life swiftly that might otherwise linger in torment. Their actions, horrific to us, were logical to them. They did not choose the system, they inherited it, as we inherit our own unseen cruelties. Imagine standing in that flickering half-light, hearing the accused whisper prayers between screams. Imagine being told that this sound, this breaking of the human voice was proof of the divine at work. To question the ritual was to question God himself, and so the mind learned to quiet its conscience. The heart, with time, stopped trembling. Habit replaced doubt. Some inquisitors wrote of moments that cracked that silence. A young woman refusing to recant even as the flames rose. A peasant who confessed, not out of pain, but to spare his family's suffering. In those moments, the architects felt something shift, a realization that the human spirit could withstand the very tool meant to break it. They called it stubbornness, but it was something else, the echo of innocence trapped inside their structure of order. The victims, too, lived within paradox. Many entered the dungeon believing they deserved their fate. The world had taught them that punishment was sacred, that pain restored harmony. Even as the ropes bit their wrists, some whispered prayers of gratitude, thanking their captors for guiding them toward purity. Others recited psalms, convinced their agony would shorten purgatory's fire. The line between victim and believer blurred until both became servants of the same belief. The architects of suffering did not build alone. They had patrons, theologians, witnesses. Each layer of authority reinforced the illusion that this system was divine, that cruelty done in the name of righteousness was not cruelty at all. It was devotion hard, necessary, unquestionable. A single voice raised against it could be silenced with the same instruments that defended faith. And yet, history records small rebellions, an apprentice executioner who refused his task and fled, a monk who confessed to hearing God's sorrow in the cries below his cell, a scribe who burned his own records, claiming the truth did not need such witnesses. Their stories remind us that belief and conscience are rarely at peace. Even in the deepest dungeons, the human heart sought escape. Still, the architecture of suffering endured for centuries. It thrived because it offered certainty, the most seductive comfort of all. The inquisitor knew his role, the executioner his timing, the victim his place. No chaos, no confusion, only purpose, only the promise that every drop of blood fell exactly where it must. And perhaps that is what made it so enduring. Its elegance. The system worked because it was built on conviction, not cruelty. Conviction can polish any act until it gleams with righteousness. A steady hand can swing the sword more faithfully than a trembling one. The architect of suffering was, in truth, an architect of belief, shaping spaces where morality and obedience fused until they were indistinguishable. If we listen closely to history, the echoes of their footsteps still sound beneath our own. Not in dungeons, but in systems we no longer question. In every rule obeyed without thought, in every punishment we call necessary, a shadow lingers. It asks the same quiet question the inquisitors once asked themselves. What if this pain is not cruelty, but order? Above, the candle gutters out. The dungeon returns to darkness, its silence perfect once more. The tools wait in neat rows, patient as prayer. Somewhere beyond the walls, bells begin to ring for evening mass, the same rhythm that guided the architects below. The world above worships, the world beneath obeys. Both believe they serve the same God. And as the sound fades, the narrator's voice lowers to a whisper. The human hand of suffering has been revealed, steady, faithful, convinced. Now, we descend further, into the tools themselves, the instruments where conviction turned into creation, and belief learned to speak through iron. The dungeon sleeps when its keepers are gone, but the tools remain awake. They wait in stillness, patient and eternal, as though memory itself were trapped inside their iron skins. Candlelight plays along their surfaces curved, polished, purposeful. To see them now is to stand before a language older than mercy, a language written not in words but in weight, form, and silence. They were more than tools. They were sermons made of metal. The Iron Maiden stands first among them, tall as a saint's shrine. Her body is forged like an embrace, hollow and waiting. From a distance, she could be mistaken for protection. Her shape curved like a mother's arms, her face calm, almost tender. Yet within her, sharp truths wait like unspoken prayers. The designers gave her the features of the Virgin, believing perhaps that holiness could sanctify horror. When the doors closed, they believed the sinner was returning to the womb of truth, that pain would give birth to redemption. The symbolism was deliberate, salvation disguised as suffocation, faith made flesh in iron. Time has stolen her sound, but if we could listen closely, perhaps we would hear the echo of breath, not of agony, but of awe. For those who built her, the Iron Maiden was less a weapon than a monument, a fusion of art and theology. Her presence declared a single truth. Even love, when claimed by power, can become a cage. Beside her rests the Judas cradle, a cruel geometry of simplicity. A wooden frame, a rope, and a pyramid of polished wood rising toward a single merciless point. Yet to its creators, it was not mere cruelty. They named it after betrayal itself, Judas, the apostle who sold salvation for silver. The condemned who met the cradle was said to ride the sinner's shape, returning to the sharp memory of treachery that all men carried within. The instrument was confession sculpted into form, the body forced to confront what the soul concealed. Its balance, its angles, even its smoothness, were calculated to prolong, not pain, but revelation. The Judas cradle teaches us something subtle about the medieval imagination. They believed truth had to be drawn from the flesh, as a sculptor draws the figure from stone. The cradle was their chisel, the condemned their unfinished work. To our eyes, the idea is monstrous. To theirs, it was spiritual craftsmanship shaping imperfection until it confessed its flaw. Farther into the chamber stands the wheel. Ancient, elemental, circular. It hums with the logic of the cosmos. Long before it turned for punishment, it turned for fortune, for time, for destiny. In pagan rites, it symbolized the eternal return, the season's unending cycle. The Church, inheriting its form, gave it new meaning, the turning of divine justice. When a body was bound to its rim, stretched across its spokes, it became an emblem of fate the sinner joined to the wheel of consequence. Each rotation whispered that no one escapes the pattern, that all things turn back to their origin. The wheel's symmetry fascinated its makers. They polished the rim until it gleamed like the halo of a saint. They set it upon stands carved with scripture, blending the sacred and the mechanical. When the sun struck its surface, it cast rings of light that trembled like stained glass across the dungeon walls. Even in darkness, it glowed faintly, as if remembering the hands that made it. Next lies the scavenger's daughter. Folded quietly in a corner, a smaller instrument, compact yet terrible in its logic. Where the rack stretched, this device compressed. Its design was paradoxical, its purpose philosophical. To teach that pride must bend, that resistance must collapse inward until humility is complete. The condemned were folded into themselves like parchment sealed by wax, their bodies mirroring the shape of prayer. To the Creator, it was not torture, but instruction. Every click of the iron hinge sounded like an amen. And then, the pear of anguish, an object of unsettling elegance. Its petals of metal open and close with delicate precision, like a flower blooming in reverse. Some were engraved with leaves, others with Latin phrases. They were made not in haste but in artistry. The device's very design betrayed its purpose: to widen, to divide, to unveil. Symbolically, it was a sermon on truth that lies, once sown in darkness, must one day blossom into exposure. In that twisted logic, the pear was not an engine of suffering but of revelation. Each of these creations shared a peculiar reverence. Their makers did not see themselves as artisans of death, but as interpreters of divine mathematics. Pain, to them, followed rules. Angles determined grace. Symmetry ensured justice. A misplaced screw, a misaligned hinge. These were moral errors as much as mechanical ones. The workshop where they were born was half forge, half chapel. Iron cooled beside holy water. Blueprints rested atop scripture. The craftsman's hand trembled not from guilt but from devotion. To the modern eye, these objects appear demonic. To the medieval mind, they were mirrors reflecting God's order through human form. In their stillness, they embodied the same precision that built cathedrals, the same balance of geometry and faith. The difference was purpose. One sought to raise souls through beauty, the other through fear. Yet both spoke the same architectural language. The arch and the shackle were siblings in design. Centuries have passed, and still they endure. In museums and archives, beneath glass and quiet light, they rest like relics of a vanished religion. Visitors lean close, their reflections trembling upon the metal surfaces. They whisper disbelief, yet linger longer than they intend. Something in these devices calls to the hidden corners of the mind, not attraction to cruelty, but recognition of pattern. We sense the order in them, the way belief can polish horror until it shines. If one listens closely, the tools seem to hum faintly, not with sound, but with memory. They remember the hands that built them, the prayers whispered over them, the strange conviction that suffering could serve the soul. Each groove, each notch, is a letter in a forgotten alphabet of faith. They are artifacts not only of punishment, but of the human attempt to give meaning to pain. What they reveal, when we look long enough, is unsettling. The same instincts that carved saints into marble also carved these. The desire to perfect, to discipline, to purify it, is the twin of creation. We build beauty to approach heaven, we build agony to understand it. The devices that remember teach that the line between salvation and domination is thinner than the edge of a blade. Imagine the silence of those chambers once the crowd was gone, the echo of chains settling, the faint crackle of dying torches. In that silence the instruments waited, not triumphant, not remorseful, but patient. They did not judge the acts they enabled. They were faithful to purpose, as tools always are. The evil or sanctity lay in the hands that turned their gears. When dawn came, the same light that streamed through church windows fell upon them. Dust drifted in golden columns, coating the iron like ash. The wheel, the maiden, the cradle, all gleamed briefly, as if heaven itself were acknowledging their service. Then the shadows returned, and the world above resumed its prayers, unaware that below, its theology of suffering was still alive in metal. Perhaps that is why these relics remain strangely magnetic. They remind us that every age builds monuments to its beliefs, some of stone, others of flesh. The medieval world inscribed its convictions in iron because iron endures. The devices outlived the faith that created them, becoming mute historians of human conviction. They hold no blame. They hold remembrance. To look upon them is to face a question that has never fully slept. When we shape instruments of order, do we also shape instruments of cruelty? When we perfect control, do we invite its shadow? The Iron Maiden, the wheel, the cradle, each answers with silence. Their sermon has already been spoken. The narrator's voice softens. The light fades from metal to memory. The dungeon exhales a final breath of smoke, carrying the scent of iron and candle wax into the night. Above, the bells begin to ring, calling the faithful not to confession but to spectacle. From confined chambers, we rise with them, out of the underground stillness and into the open square, where punishment will shed its secrecy and become performance. The morning arrives with a brightness that feels almost cruel. Sunlight spills over the rooftops, washing the medieval square in gold. From every street, footsteps converge, the measured pace of monks, the shuffle of peasants, the clatter of noble horses. The air hums with the weight of expectation. Somewhere, a bell rings, not in warning but in rhythm, marking the hour when justice will be made visible. Justice was not hidden. It was celebrated. For the people of this town, such a day is neither horror nor holiday but something between the two, a ritual that belongs to everyone. Bakers open early, their bread scent mingling with the sharp tang of iron. Vendors arrange apples, meat pies, and ale near the square's edges. Children dart through the crowd, chasing echoes of laughter, though even they seem quieter than usual. Every sound carries reverence, as if the air itself remembers what is about to unfold. The scaffold stands at the centre, freshly built, the wood pale and new. To modern eyes it would look obscene. To them it is familiar, almost comforting. It represents order, the same way a church represents faith. Its beams are measured, its ropes coiled neatly, its steps aligned with the geometry of belief. People gather around it as one might gather around an altar. The space is not chaotic, it is choreographed. Every presence here has meaning, the priest with his scriptures, the magistrate with his scroll, the soldiers guarding the edges, the town crier ready to speak. Together they form the anatomy of justice, a living organism whose heartbeat is the crowd itself. They come for many reasons. Some to see wrongness corrected, some to be reassured that sin does not go unanswered. Others come simply because everyone else does. In the Middle Ages, to stay home on execution day was to stand outside the circle of belonging. The spectacle reminded people not only of law but of their place within it. The sinner's fall affirmed the innocence of those who watched. In that shared gaze, fear became unity. As the square fills, the mood ripples between excitement and unease. A juggler performs near the fountain, his coloured balls flashing in the sunday. A blind singer hums an old ballad about saints and thieves. Mothers hush their children, whispering that this is what happens when one strays from the path. The church bells answer in deep tones, and the murmuring stills. From a balcony above, nobles lean over carved railings. Their garments shimmer with silk and badge of rank. For them, this is spectacle wrapped in duty, a reminder that their authority flows downward like the sunlight that bathes the square. They will watch, not with cruelty, but with solemn satisfaction, as order reasserts itself through punishment. Below them, peasants press close, faces lifted, eyes wide. Their clothes smell of soil and sweat, their hearts a strange mixture of dread and curiosity. They tell themselves they come to learn a moral lesson, but something deeper draws them a fascination with the forbidden, the trembling edge between sin and sanctity. They know the condemned will suffer, yet part of them seeks to see, to understand what it means to stand at the edge of judgment and feel the breath of eternity. The clergy arrive next. Monks in black and brown habits walk in procession, candles flickering even under daylight. They chant softly, their Latin words rising above the restless murmur of the crowd. The sound carries the illusion of order, a reminder that heaven watches. They believe their presence sanctifies what is about to occur. Pain without prayer is cruelty. Pain within prayer is purification. The line between the two is drawn by their voices. Then comes the condemned. A hush falls across the square like a held breath. Chains clink, not loudly but distinctly, the sound slicing through the silence. The prisoner walks between guards, barefoot, face pale beneath the grime. Their expression is neither rage nor fear, but something quieter resignation touched by disbelief. For days, the town has spoken their name. Now the body behind the name stands before them. The crier reads the sentence. Each word echoes from the surrounding walls, bouncing off stone like prophecy. The charge, the confession, the decree, all spoken in rhythm, as though justice itself were being conjured aloud. The condemned kneels. The priest steps forward with a crucifix, murmuring of repentance, of heaven's mercy waiting beyond the scaffold. The crowd leans closer, hungry for the words of surrender. A tear, a whisper, even a faint tremor of the lips will serve as proof that faith has triumphed. For them, this moment is not execution but conversion. The sinner, purified through suffering, will pass from chaos into order. The act is both warning and reassurance. Parents tighten their grip on their children's hands. Young men stare with fascination. The elderly bow their heads, remembering that they too will soon face judgment of another kind. The psychology of the crowd unfolds like a tide. Fear pulling against fascination, pity mingling with satisfaction. No one sees themselves as cruel. They see themselves as witnesses to righteousness. Their presence, they believe, gives meaning to the act. Without their eyes, justice would remain incomplete. It must be seen to exist. And so the event becomes communion. The noble and the peasant, the priest and the beggar, all joined in a single act of belief. In this shared moment, the boundaries of class and privilege blur. All stand beneath the same moral sky. All feel the same tremor in their chests as the ritual proceeds. For a fleeting instant, unity replaces division. The punishment is no longer the condemned's alone, it belongs to everyone. What the people do not realize is that they, too, are participants in the theatre of obedience. Each gaze affirms the authority that binds them. Each cheer or prayer renews the invisible contract between ruler and subject, heaven and earth. The spectacle reminds them that justice, like faith, demands witnesses, and witnesses must never look away. The executioner steps forward, his movements deliberate, almost reverent. He adjusts the rope, checks the knot, touches the beam as if testing an instrument before a hymn. To him, this is ceremony, the closing act of divine order. The crowd holds its breath. A breeze stirs the banners overhead, carrying with it the smell of hay, sweat, and anticipation. When the moment comes, it happens swiftly. The sound is brief, the motion controlled, the silence immediate. A gasp ripples through the mass of bodies, then stillness, an enormous stillness filled with both relief and discomfort. Some cross themselves, others murmur prayers, a few look away. The rest stare longer than they should, as though trying to see the invisible, the passage of a soul leaving the body. And then, as all rituals do, the event dissolves into aftermath. The priest speaks of redemption. The magistrate declares the town cleansed. Vendors reopen their stalls. Children resume their laughter. The square exhales. The crowd disperses slowly, not talking loudly, not in celebration, but in quiet completion. Something sacred has ended. Something ordinary begins again. As the scaffold empties, the question lingers like smoke. Why did they come? To witness justice, to reassure themselves of righteousness, or to glimpse, for a moment, the mystery of mortality disguised as morality? The answer lies somewhere between fear and fascination, the ancient need to see consequence made flesh. The sun moves west, casting long shadows that stretch across the square like ribbons of memory. A stray dog noses the ground where the crowd once stood. The air smells faintly of wax and dust. High above, church bells begin their slow tolling, not of mourning but of closure. The day of judgment has ended, and the rhythm of life resumes its steady pulse. From the window of a tavern, an old woman watches the emptying street. She whispers a prayer not for the condemned, but for those who watched for the countless eyes that mistook spectacle for faith. Outside, the wind carries away the last echo of the crowd's breath. The world feels lighter, though no one can say why. The narrator pauses. The sound of distant bells fades into silence. The crowd's unity dissolves into solitude. For a brief span, the listener can almost feel the square emptying beneath their own feet, the shifting from order to quiet, from spectacle to stillness. Justice, once performed, becomes memory. And memory, like faith, has its own stages of fading. From the crowd's gaze, we move inward now into the eyes of the condemned, into the silence that follows the final breath, to see what it meant to face the end upon that stage where everyone believed they were watching salvation unfold. Night descends quietly over the town. The square that held thousands by morning now lies empty, save for the echo of its own silence. The scaffold stands like an altar stripped of ceremony, its wood pale beneath the moon. Inside a narrow stone chamber not far away, a man waits for dawn. His hands are bound, but loosely not in cruelty, only in formality. A single candle burns beside him, its flame small and unsteady, a flicker between this world and the next. For the condemned, time no longer moves forward. It breathes, slowly, like an animal settling into sleep. He can hear the distant creak of the wooden beams above, the faint steps of a guard outside the door. Somewhere far off, a bell tolls for evening prayers. He listens, not with fear, but with a strange calm. In dying, he will carry the sins of those who watched. The priest enters quietly, the smell of incense trailing behind his robe. He closes the door gently, as if not to disturb the air. The candle's light touches both their faces, the weary and the penitent, the absolver and the absolved. Between them lies a wooden crucifix and a small piece of bread. No feast, no spectacle, only the quiet ritual of farewell. "Do you repent?" the priest asks, his voice soft enough to dissolve into the shadows. The prisoner hesitates, not because he doubts, but because the word itself feels vast. To repent is to undo time, to walk backward through every moment that led here. He lowers his head. "I do," he whispers, though the sound is closer to a sigh. Outside, the world still believes that this ritual serves justice. But inside the cell, the lines blur. The condemned is no longer the enemy of order, nor the priest its instrument. Both are men standing at the edge of understanding, one about to cross it, the other destined to remain. The priest murmurs scripture, words polished smooth by centuries of repetition. The prisoner repeats them, each syllable carrying the weight of every silence he never knew how to confess. There is a rhythm to these last hours, a choreography of humility. The confession, the absolution, the final blessing. In each step, the condemned is stripped of identity until only the soul remains. To the church, this process is purification. To the man, it feels like fading. And yet, in that fading, something luminous flickers, not fear, not regret, but release. The priest takes his hand and traces a cross upon his forehead. The gesture is gentle, almost fatherly. "God forgives all who ask," he says. The words are meant to comfort, but they also bind. The condemned nods, though his thoughts wander beyond the walls to the fields he will never see again, to the laughter of a woman whose name he cannot speak aloud. Each memory passes like a shadow across his mind, vanishing into stillness. There is no clock here, yet they both feel the hour approaching. The candle grows shorter, the wax pools thick and white at its base. The priest opens his satchel and removes a small loaf of bread, a flask of wine. The sacrament is given. The condemned swallows slowly, tasting forgiveness in the dry crumbs. He closes his eyes. "It is finished," he whispers, echoing words older than both of them. In dying, he carries the sins of those who watched not because they wished him harm, but because they needed his fall to believe in their own innocence. His suffering becomes a vessel for their fears. Through him they purge what they cannot name: envy, anger, the quiet rebellion that lives in every heart. Tomorrow, when the rope tightens and the crowd sighs in relief, they will feel lighter, though nothing in the world will have truly changed. The priest knows this. He has heard 100 final confessions, seen every kind of remorse, the desperate, the defiant, the silent. Yet each time, the ritual feels fragile, like glass that might shatter under its own holiness. He wonders whether forgiveness can truly erase pain, or whether it only cloaks it in ritual. The thought troubles him, but he does not speak it. Instead he prays. Their voices blend, rising softly into the damp air. The Latin phrases sound almost musical, each word a thread stitching the soul back toward heaven. The candle flickers, and for a moment the flame casts a halo upon the prisoner's bowed head. The priest sees it and feels an ache in his chest. Not pity, but awe. He thinks, perhaps, that God's mercy has already arrived. Outside, the guards shift restlessly. One whispers a joke, another hums a tune to ward off unease. They will not speak of what happens tomorrow, yet all feel its gravity pressing against their hearts. The condemned man is not evil to them, merely chosen. The crowd will see justice, the guards see duty. Each tells himself the same lie that necessity absolves intention. As night deepens, the prisoner asks the priest for one last favour. "Let me hear the Psalms," he says. The priest nods and begins to recite. His voice drifts through the cell, low and steady, painting images of shepherds, rivers, green pastures that no dungeon can contain. The words fill the room like light, and for a moment the prisoner feels the walls dissolve. He imagines walking beyond them, barefoot across dew-soaked grass, the air cool against his skin. He imagines forgiveness as a landscape, wide and quiet, waiting just beyond the gallows. When the psalm ends, silence settles again. The priest rises, places a hand on the man's shoulder, and whispers the final blessing. "Go in peace," he says. "You have made your confession." The condemned smiles faintly, a gesture of gratitude rather than joy. The priest departs, leaving the door slightly ajar. The candle burns lower still, its flame trembling in the draught. Alone now, the man sits in the soft rhythm of his own breath. He wonders if his death will matter, if tomorrow's spectacle will change anything at all. Perhaps it will teach children obedience, reassure rulers of order, remind the fearful that sin has consequence. But beyond that, he knows the world will forget. In a few days, his name will fade, his story reduced to a sentence in a ledger. Yet he also senses something larger, that in dying, he becomes part of the same pattern that shaped his life. Pain offered as proof, suffering turned into lesson. He leans his head against the wall and closes his eyes. The stone feels cool, grounding. Somewhere in the stillness, he thinks he hears footsteps, soft, measured, echoing down a corridor of time. Perhaps it is the memory of all who came before him, those who confessed, repented, and vanished. Their voices blend into one great silence that feels like prayer. Dawn finds him calm. The candle has burned to a stub. The cell smells of smoke and wax. A guard enters, removes the chains, and leads him toward the light spilling through the doorway. The condemned walks steadily, neither proud nor broken. His confession has done its work. Whatever fear remains is gentle, almost human. The streets outside are already stirring. The people will gather again, the same as before. They will whisper that the condemned met his end with grace, that his words at the scaffold sounded holy. Some will even call him brave. In their telling, he becomes a story to soothe their own unease, a vessel of redemption, not rebellion. In dying, he carries them all. As he reaches the base of the scaffold, he looks toward the sky. The clouds drift lazily above the rooftops, unbothered by the rituals of men. The priest waits nearby, murmuring another prayer, his voice steady though his hands tremble. The condemned kneels, kisses the crucifix, and whispers a final thought meant only for heaven. The rope is set. The crowd watches, silent, suspended between reverence and fear. The moment stretches thin as glass, and then release. A breath leaves the body. A weight lifts from the air. The priest lowers his head. The crowd exhales as one. The condemned is gone, yet his presence lingers, diffused among them like incense. They will return home lighter, their guilt absorbed by another's suffering. The ritual has worked, at least for now. But somewhere in the quiet corners of their hearts, a small unease will remain, the faint sense that what they witnessed was not just justice, but something older, something deeply human. The need to see death and call it redemption. The narrator's voice fades to a whisper, soft as the extinguishing candle. The square sleeps once more. And from this silence, history will awaken into a new age when faith begins to wane, and punishment learns to wear the mask of reason. Morning returns to Europe, but it is not the same dawn. The air feels lighter, the sky wider. The bells that once tolled for penance now ring for progress. Streets that smelled of incense and ash fill with the scent of ink, parchment and oil paint. The old cathedrals still stand, but their shadows have shortened. The world has tilted toward something new, a faith not in heaven, but in reason. They stopped burning bodies, but not minds. The great change did not come in a single hour. It crept quietly through the corridors of learning, through the polished words of philosophers, and the discoveries of men who measured stars instead of souls. Truth began to shift its throne. No longer the voice of God descending from pulpits, it became the whisper of observation, experiment, and debate. Yet beneath this newfound light, old instincts hid, waiting for a new language to clothe them. Justice followed this transformation. The pyres went cold, but punishment did not vanish, it evolved. The flames of faith became the walls of confinement. Where once the sinner's body was consumed in public, now the offender's mind would be contained in silence. The gallows gave way to the cell. The spectacle of judgment became the architecture of isolation. Society congratulated itself on enlightenment, unaware that cruelty had only changed its costume. The Renaissance adored beauty, but beauty, like truth, demanded control. Artists painted divine perfection onto canvas. Rulers sought to impose the same order upon their subjects. The Inquisition dimmed, but bureaucracy took its place. A new priesthood of clerks and magistrates, weighing morality in columns and codes. Human behavior was catalogued, measured, and judged by systems rather than sermons. The scaffold still stood, but it now faced an audience that preferred discretion to devotion. The Enlightenment promised freedom through knowledge, yet its first lesson was discipline. To know the mind, one must regulate it. The philosophers spoke of reason as liberation, but the rulers heard only efficiency. Prisons multiplied where monasteries once stood. The confessional became the interrogation room. The monk's vow of silence transformed into enforced solitude. The criminal was no longer purified through pain, he was corrected through observation. And observation, they believed, was mercy made scientific. The dungeon grew brighter, cleaner, quieter. There were no torches, no chants, no crowds. Only light filtered through narrow windows, and footsteps echoing down corridors of stone. The condemned no longer screamed, they thought. They were given time to reflect, to reform, to internalize the moral architecture that once surrounded them. The church had once ruled through the fear of hell. Now the state ruled through the fear of oneself. A strange nostalgia settled over the world, not for cruelty, but for clarity. In the old order, punishment had purpose, to save the soul, to cleanse the community. In the new, it became administrative, abstract, faceless. The executioner disappeared, replaced by the warden. The ritual faded, leaving only routine. What had once been divine theatre became mechanical maintenance of obedience. Still, beneath the marble and manners, the same pulse remained. The desire to correct, to perfect, to purify through suffering. It lived on in new forms in labour camps disguised as moral reform, in the quiet corridors of asylums where silence echoed louder than any scream. The age of reason inherited faith's obsession with order, but stripped away its prayers. The body was no longer punished to save the soul, it was disciplined to serve the system. The Renaissance built prisons the way it once built cathedrals with pride. Architects designed them as monuments of civility, geometric sanctuaries of control. Iron bars aligned like columns, windows placed with mathematical precision. Even cruelty aspired to symmetry. The design spoke of enlightenment, yet every angle whispered confinement. The prisoner, like the sinner before him, was meant to contemplate his transgression through structure itself, through the slow rhythm of passing days, the echo of his own footsteps within measured walls. It is easy to mistake quiet for kindness. The absence of spectacle made punishment appear humane. But in that silence, cruelty found a more intimate form. Public agony had at least been shared, collective, cathartic. Now suffering became solitary. The condemned no longer performed for the crowd, he performed for his conscience. The flames that once devoured the body now burned inward, invisible but unrelenting. The cell replaced the square, and repentance became self-surveillance. The philosophers called it progress. They wrote that civilization had matured, that reason had tamed barbarity. Yet the same human heart that once knelt before the cross now bowed before the law. The priest and the magistrate spoke different languages but promised the same salvation, correction through obedience. The holy wound became the moral scar. Enlightenment, in its certainty, demanded conformity just as faith once did. Even art, that mirror of its time, revealed the tension. Paintings of saints gave way to portraits of scholars, but both faces bore the same expression serenity achieved through discipline. The body still symbolized virtue, but now it was measured by posture and composure rather than piety. The ideal citizen was orderly, rational, restrained. Passion, once seen as divine fire, became a symptom of imbalance. Emotion was the new sin. As centuries turned, the architecture of punishment spread across nations like a shadowed reflection of civilization itself. The prisons of Paris, London, and Rome stood as silent witnesses to the age's contradictions, temples of progress that functioned as tombs of freedom. Inside, the condemned learned to whisper apologies to walls instead of confessing to priests. Outside, society congratulated itself on mercy. No more fires, no more screams, only efficiency. They stopped burning bodies, the narrator murmurs, but not minds. The new justice burned slower, deeper, and with less smoke. It reshaped thought, teaching people to fear not the stake, but the gaze, the idea that someone, somewhere, might be watching, recording, judging. What began as moral purification became surveillance disguised as virtue. Reason did not abolish punishment. It refined it. The soul was no longer saved but studied. The sinner became a subject for science, his pain an experiment in rehabilitation. Faith had offered absolution through confession. Reason offered reform through control. The difference was tone, not substance. Both sought to mold human behavior into harmony with an invisible ideal. And yet, amid this quiet order, a melancholy settled. The world had lost its sense of drama, its ritual of release. The scaffold, for all its horror, had been honest, its cruelty visible, undeniable. The prison, by contrast, hid its violence behind civility. Pain no longer echoed in the square, it whispered behind doors. Society had traded spectacle for suppression, guilt for monotony. The narrator's voice slows, almost wistful. The age of faith had believed in redemption. The age of reason believed in correction. Both misunderstood mercy, for mercy cannot be engineered. It cannot be written into law or measured by reform. It requires seeing the other not as sinner or subject, but as self. And that vision, despite all progress, remained as distant as ever. Even now, ruins of old prisons stand across Europe, ivy creeping up their walls, sunlight slipping through broken bars. Tourists wander their corridors, whispering about ghosts. Yet the ghosts are not the prisoners. They are the ideas that built those walls, the belief that pain, properly organized, could create goodness, that control could replace compassion. As the Enlightenment dawns fully, the torch passes from faith to reason, but its flame stays the same. It flickers through centuries, illuminating not only knowledge but the shadows knowledge cannot erase. Humanity steps forward, proud of its progress, unaware that it still drags chains forged in older fires. The narrator pauses, the tone softening like the end of a prayer. The fires of faith have dimmed, replaced by the cold light of calculation. Yet cruelty, ever adaptable, waits in the silence, ready to wear the mask of logic. From these changing institutions, the story turns toward the inevitable question. When cruelty learns to whisper, how does it survive within the walls of civilization itself? Even the quietest age invents its own instruments of pain. They no longer drip with blood or echo with screams. They hum instead softly, persistently through wires, through walls, through the endless murmur of judgment disguised as concern. Cruelty never vanished. It simply learned to whisper. The modern world prides itself on civility. It builds clean cities, writes fair laws, and calls itself humane. Yet beneath the polished surface, an older rhythm beats on the same instinct that once demanded the spectacle of the scaffold. The crowd still gathers, only now it gathers behind screens. The condemned still stand in the square, only now the square has no walls. Public shame no longer smells of smoke, it glows in pixels. The ritual continues, draped in the language of progress. In medieval times, punishment was visible, an act of theatre. In ours, it is psychological, an act of participation. We are both audience and executioner, priest and sinner. The old instruments have been replaced by subtler tools, cameras, credit scores, social hierarchies that reward obedience with comfort and exile the disobedient through silence. Once, the whip cracked in the open air. Now, the same command hides behind notifications and polite phrases. You are being observed, behave. The medieval soul feared hell. The modern soul fears disapproval. Both are cages, built from faith in invisible judgment. Where once the church promised salvation through suffering, now society promises acceptance through conformity. The rules have changed, but the logic endures. To deviate is to risk erasure. To confess is to survive. We call it transparency, but it is penance by another name. Consider the prison, the clean successor to the dungeon. It hums with fluorescent light instead of candle flame, its walls painted the colour of calm. But within those walls, the same mechanism unfolds. Isolation, repetition, reflection. The prisoner is told he will be reformed, not damned, yet the structure remains a sermon on obedience. Surveillance replaces the priest. Routine replaces prayer. The mind, alone with itself, becomes its own inquisitor. Michel Foucault once wrote that the perfect prison would need no guards, only visibility. When every cell is watched, the prisoner begins to police himself. The medieval sinner feared the eye of God. The modern subject fears the lens of society. We behave not because we are good, but because we are seen. The gaze has become divine, infinite, and everywhere. It requires no fire, no rack, no iron. Its punishment is subtler: exhaustion, anxiety, the slow erosion of privacy. Cruelty's new disguise is gentle, precisely because it flatters. It tells us we are free, while quietly measuring every motion of our lives. It speaks in the language of safety, improvement, and care. Surveillance is sold as protection. Correction is marketed as rehabilitation. Public confession becomes therapy. Public humiliation becomes accountability. The system wears the smile of empathy, but beneath it lies the same conviction that shaped the Iron Maiden, that pain, properly managed, will make us pure. Even outside the prison walls, invisible chains bind the spirit. The workplace, the classroom, the algorithm, all inherit the logic of the scaffold. We perform our virtue daily, offering our curated selves for judgment. Likes and approval replace absolution. Silence replaces exile. The medieval penitent knelt before the priest. The modern user kneels before the feed. Both whisper the same plea: see me, forgive me, let me belong. This transformation of punishment into participation is what makes it so enduring. No one forces us into the square anymore. We step into it willingly. We share, confess, perform, and repent under the illusion of freedom. Every word becomes a record, every act a moral ledger. The Inquisition has been internalized. The dungeon now lives within the mind, well-lit, climate-controlled, self-sustaining. And yet, for all our progress, the architecture remains familiar. The modern city mirrors the monastery. Grids of streets, schedules of labour, rituals of productivity. Even leisure follows the same discipline. We measure rest by its efficiency, forgiveness by its usefulness. We fear idleness, the way our ancestors feared sin. The whip has become invisible, woven into expectation. The soul still kneels not before God, but before performance itself. The gentle disguise also hides in language. We no longer speak of sin, but of failure, no longer of heresy, but of non-compliance. The words have softened, yet their edges remain. To fail is to fall from grace, not divine grace, but social. Redemption requires apology, reform, a public ritual of contrition. We wear our remorse in hashtags, our penance in careful statements. Each apology is weighed for sincerity, each silence for guilt. The ritual remains communal. Forgiveness is granted by consensus, not compassion. Listen closely, and you can hear the same hymns playing in new keys. The medieval crowd shouted for justice. We call for accountability. They burned heretics to protect faith. We cancel reputations to protect virtue. Each era believes it acts from righteousness, unaware that righteousness itself is the oldest disguise cruelty ever wore. We no longer torture bodies, we exhaust spirits. We no longer parade sinners, we isolate them until they vanish. The difference is method, not motive. There is irony in how progress has perfected control. The medieval world required chains and guards. We require none. Our obedience is voluntary, our surveillance self-inflicted. We document ourselves, confess our habits, broadcast our desires. The church needed confessions. Now we give them freely, in data. The line between privacy and penance has disappeared, replaced by constant illumination. We live beneath the halo of visibility, radiant, restless, never alone. Some call it civilization, others call it refinement. But in the quiet hours, when the screens dim and the world slows, a faint unease stirs a sense that we have traded one form of submission for another. The medieval believer feared eternal judgment. We fear irrelevance. Both punish through exclusion. Both promise salvation through perfection. And still, we return to the square. Each scandal, each public fall, reminds us that we are part of something ancient, a collective craving for moral cleansing. We watch, we judge, we forgive, and we forget. The ritual is self-sustaining because it comforts us. To see another fall is to feel, briefly, safe from falling ourselves. Perhaps this is why cruelty survives not as violence, but as rhythm. It is the heartbeat of order, pulsing beneath every age's architecture. The scaffold, the prison, the algorithm all share the same pulse. They remind us that obedience feels like peace, that silence feels like safety, that belonging feels like virtue. The gentle disguise of modernity is not deceit, it is desire. We wish to be seen as good, and so we endure the gaze that never sleeps. In this light, history is less a story of progress than of transformation. The tools change, but the logic endures. Correction as love, control as mercy, visibility as virtue. Humanity, ever inventive, refines its methods but rarely its motives. We cannot abandon the idea that suffering purifies, we only make it quieter. The narrator's tone softens, almost sorrowful. The dungeon's darkness has given way to the screen's glow, but the lesson remains. Cruelty whispers now, and we lean closer to hear. The walls have turned transparent, the punishments invisible, but the architecture of obedience still surrounds us. It feels gentle, but it holds firm. Outside, night deepens. The city hums with light, its windows like 1,000 watching eyes. Somewhere, someone scrolls through the latest confession, the newest downfall. The ritual continues, unending and unseen. And so the question lingers, calm but unyielding. If faith once bound the soul, and reason now binds, the mind, has humanity ever truly escaped the medieval idea of control? The narrator pauses, letting the silence answer. Then, with a whisper almost lost to the night, cruelty never vanished. It simply learned to whisper. From this reflection, we will turn our gaze backward to the stories that did not survive progress. The punishments erased not only from law but from memory, hidden in the folds of time, waiting for history to remember them again. There are corners of history where even light hesitates to linger. The records thin, the ink fades, and what remains is silence, deliberate, defensive, almost sacred. For every execution remembered, for every law preserved in parchment, there were a dozen more that disappeared without trace. Some punishments were so cruel, even history refused to remember them. These were not the grand spectacles of justice, performed in daylight for the crowd's moral reassurance. These were the quiet erasures, the punishments dealt in secret, reserved for those whose very existence threatened the fragile story a civilization told about itself. Heretics who believed too deeply. Healers who cured in ways the church could not explain. Women who read the stars. Men who dreamed aloud of other gods, other worlds. Their names seldom survived, but the shadow of their fate still drifts beneath our collective memory, like bones buried under polished floors. The chronicles, written by priests and kings, were careful in their omissions. They spoke of virtue, of order, of divine law, but seldom of what was done to preserve it. The cruelty that contradicted faith was hidden, scrubbed from ledgers, burned with the bodies of its victims. Yet whispers remain. Monks' marginal notes, travellers' letters, the odd confession found among the archives of forgotten monasteries. They speak softly of rituals that blurred the line between punishment and disappearance. Exile was among the most merciful of these unspoken sentences. To be cast out of one's village, branded in silence, was to vanish without spectacle, to die without death. The condemned were sent beyond the forest's edge, forbidden to speak to any who remained. For healers accused of witchcraft, this was both punishment and test. Survive in wilderness, and perhaps God had indeed chosen you. Few returned. Those who did came back, changed eyes hollow, words slow, carrying the weight of the unseen. More sinister were the punishments of symbolic death. In some towns, heretics were declared dead in spirit, before being sealed alive in stone alcoves, their presence erased, their breath entombed within church walls. The ceremony was quiet, a priest's whisper, a trowel of mortar, the congregation kneeling as the final stone was set. Officially, no blood was spilled. The chronicles described these moments as acts of purification, yet the walls, centuries later, still seemed to hum faintly at night, as if the prayers within had never ceased. There were those who suffered punishments that could not be named. Inquisition records speak in euphemism, questioning by spiritual means, methods of divine persuasion. The phrases are careful veils over unspeakable acts. The condemned were not tortured for confession alone, but to erase their ideas entirely, to ensure that memory itself would recoil from them. It was not enough to kill the heretic. One had to destroy the echo of what they believed. And so, history learned the art of selective amnesia. What could not be justified was not written down. What could not be sanctified was silenced. The chronicles of saints swelled, while the stories of their victims turned to dust. The medieval world built its identity not only on what it recorded, but on what it buried. Every monument to holiness stood upon invisible graves. The healers suffered especially. Their crime was not defiance, but knowledge remedies drawn from herbs, from stars, from intuition older than scripture. To the church, such wisdom without divine sanction was a threat. When the healer's cures succeeded where prayer failed, she became evidence of an unsettling truth, that power might exist outside authority. So her punishment had to be absolute, not only destruction but erasure. Her name stricken from baptismal records, her home razed, her tools burned. The church called it cleansing, she called it silence. There are traces still. In rural chapels, faded murals show faceless figures kneeling beside crosses. The outlines carefully repainted centuries later, features lost. In convent libraries, marginal notes speak of sisters who strayed too near the flame. The language is coded, the guilt shared. It is as if the scribes themselves feared what memory might awaken if they wrote too clearly. Some say these forgotten punishments were the purest form of control, for they left no martyrs, no relics, no songs. A public death could inspire sympathy. An unspoken one inspired only doubt. When a person vanished, unacknowledged, society was spared the burden of explanation. Silence became the most efficient executioner. The condemned who vanished into that silence became symbols of something deeper, the parts of humanity each age chooses to disown. Every civilization buries its contradictions. The medieval world, in its obsession with purity, could not tolerate the grey between sin and sanctity. The healer who blended faith with science, the scholar who questioned miracles, the woman whose knowledge came from dreams, all were reminders that the world was not as ordered as doctrine promised. And so they were erased, for their existence endangered certainty itself. In this erasure lies a strange kind of immortality. The unnamed, the unrecorded, the disappeared, they become eternal precisely because they cannot be contained by story. Their absence haunts history like an unfinished prayer. We sense them in gaps between words, in the sudden vagueness of chroniclers' accounts, in the phrases that trail off, and then she was taken, and he was seen no more. The narrator's voice softens, as though leaning closer to the listener. Every silence, it says, has a cause. And in that silence, we hear the echo of fear, the fear of contradiction, of complexity, of truth that refuses simplicity. The church feared it. The crown feared it. Even the people feared it. For to acknowledge the forgotten was to question the foundation of their own innocence. It is easy, centuries later, to pity those who vanished. Harder to admit how much we resemble those who erased them. We too curate our history, polish our narratives, forget what does not flatter our reflection. Our archives are digital now, our deletions quicker, but the instinct remains the same. We hide the uncomfortable, rename the inconvenient, silence what cannot be forgiven. The method changes, the motive endures. The candlelight in the imagined chamber of this story flickers lower. The air grows thick with the ghosts of the unrecorded. Somewhere, parchment curls inward, its ink fading into nothing. Yet even as words vanish, their absence leaves a mark. To forget something completely is impossible. Memory, like the soul, resists annihilation. It lingers in the faint unease that touches us when we feel history's breath, but cannot find its face. The listener is left to wonder, how many walls hold voices that will never be heard again? How many stories lie beneath our cathedrals of progress, still whispering through stone? The past does not end. It hides, and in its hiding, it watches. Outside, the wind stirs the leaves, carrying with it the scent of rain and soil, the same earth that once covered the nameless dead. The narrator's voice falls to a whisper. Every civilization writes its glory in ink and its shame in silence. Now the silence shifts, preparing to reveal its mirror image, those moments when cruelty was not hidden but transformed, disguised as holiness. For from these forgotten crimes will rise another kind of mystery. Punishments so exquisite, so radiant in their cruelty, that they were mistaken for miracles. To suffer was to be remembered, but only if you suffered beautifully. In the old world, pain could make you a monster or a miracle. It all depended on who was watching. The same wound that condemned one soul could sanctify another. The same fire that consumed a heretic could illuminate a saint. Between the ashes of punishment and the incense of devotion, the line blurred until holiness and heresy shared the same flame. The chronicles tell of saints who bled willingly, their agony transfigured into poetry. They speak of holy women who refused to recant, of monks who welcomed scourges as divine caresses, of martyrs who smiled through the smoke of their own burning. Yet beside their names whispered in prayers and carved into altars, there were others, erased or twisted into cautionary tales. Those were the scapegoats, accused witches, heretics, and healers whose suffering was no less pure, only less convenient. They, too, endured the ritual of pain. But their agony was not recorded as faith. It was renamed sin. Saints and scapegoats were made of the same substance bodies marked by belief. What separated them was not their virtue but their audience. The saint's suffering was seen as voluntary, the scapegoat's as deserved. Both were mirrors reflecting a society desperate to justify its cruelty through meaning. One was exalted, the other extinguished. Yet in their faces, if we look closely, the same expression lingers, an almost serene defiance, as if both knew that endurance, in the end, would outlast judgment. Consider St. Catherine of Alexandria, the scholar and visionary. When she refused to renounce her faith, they brought forth the breaking wheel, that ancient emblem of fate. The legend says it shattered at her touch, defying its own purpose. Whether true or not, the story reveals something deeper. The wheel was more than a weapon. It was a stage, a halo of iron that transformed the condemned into a spectacle of purity. The miracle lay not in physics, but in perception. The crowd needed to see that pain could serve the divine, that beauty could survive torment. Now imagine a nameless woman in another century, accused of witchcraft for the same refusal, her body tied not to a wheel, but to a stake. No miracle interrupted her suffering. No story softened her screams. She burned as Catherine might have, but without witnesses who believed in her holiness. Her ashes scattered, her name unspoken, her memory erased. Yet in both flames, one gilded, one forgotten, burned the same fire, the human hunger to turn agony into meaning. The church, the crowd, even the victim herself, all were bound by this strange alchemy. Pain was currency, traded for eternity. To die well was to triumph, to die wrongly was to vanish. And so the difference between sanctity and blasphemy often rested on a whisper, a gesture, a single sentence at the moment of judgment. St. Joan of Arc stood on that knife edge. To her accusers, she was a heretic. To her followers, a prophet. Both saw the same young woman in armour, her voice trembling yet unbroken. When the flames rose around her, she cried not for mercy, but for truth. Centuries later, the church that condemned her declared her a saint. Nothing changed but the narrative. The ashes remained the same. This pattern of condemnation, transfigured into reverence, runs through all ages. The saint's halo is the scapegoat's noose turned sideways, catching the light. The martyr's relics are the remnants of what was once forbidden. In time, the instruments of death become icons of devotion. Nails become relics. Ashes become blessings. Suffering, polished by retelling, becomes art. But behind every miracle lies a silence, the silence of those whose suffering did not fit the story. For every Joan, 1,000 unnamed burned in the same fire. For every Catherine, countless others vanished beneath the same wheel. History keeps the beautiful deaths and buries the inconvenient ones. It remembers the flames that inspire and forget the ones that accuse. Still, the line between saint and scapegoat is not merely historical, it is human. We create it even now, in quieter ways. We admire those who endure pain gracefully, who turn wounds into wisdom, who suffer with dignity. Yet we look away from the unpoetic agony, the grief that offers no moral, no redemption. We sanctify the pain that flatters our sense of purpose, and exile the pain that challenges it. The medieval world understood this instinct well. It turned suffering into theatre, but also into theology. The saint's agony was not tragedy, but triumph proof that the soul could transcend the body. The scapegoat's pain, by contrast, was spectacle of warning. Both roles reassured the audience that order still ruled chaos. In this way, cruelty became moral architecture, a structure of belief where every scream reinforced stability. The narrator's voice softens, almost mournful. Imagine, it says, a world so afraid of imperfection that it punished beauty for being misunderstood. That was the world that made both saints and scapegoats a world that could not tell the difference between holiness and defiance. To stand apart was to risk both exaltation and annihilation. In this paradox lies the essence of the age, that holiness was indistinguishable from heresy until history chose a winner. The saint's miracle was not her endurance, but her survival in memory. She was preserved because her story served faith. The scapegoat perished because hers did not. Yet both embodied the same truth that pain, when witnessed, becomes prophecy. Sometimes, the transformation happened long after death. A village healer once cursed as a witch might centuries later be remembered as a wise woman. A condemned scholar might be rebranded as a visionary. What the past called sin, the future often calls insight. The difference is not in the act but in the distance between judgment and remembrance. Art played its part in this resurrection. Painters rendered saints in moments of luminous suffering, flesh pierced but faces serene. Their eyes lifted heavenward, their wounds transformed into decoration. The sight comforted viewers. If agony could look so peaceful, perhaps suffering had meaning after all. Yet that very beauty concealed the violence beneath. The artist became the final inquisitor, sanctifying pain through composition, preserving the illusion that suffering ennobles. And so the saint and the scapegoat became reflections of each other, two sides of the same mirror, both necessary to sustain belief. The crowd needed examples of both, one to worship, one to fear. The saint offered the hope of transcendence, the scapegoat, the reassurance that disorder could be contained. Their stories framed the boundaries of morality, teaching the living where virtue ended and danger began. But every mirror eventually cracks. As centuries passed, the line between sacred and profane began to blur once more. Skeptics questioned the miracles. Philosophers asked whether holiness required suffering at all. The saint's serenity began to look like resignation, the scapegoat's defiance like courage. Slowly, the world realized that both were victims of the same machinery, the same hunger to purify through pain. And yet, even now, the myth endures. We still glorify the ones who suffer gracefully, still mistrust those whose pain disrupts our peace. We still draw halos around endurance and shadows around rebellion. The medieval heart beats quietly within us, measuring virtue by the silence with which it endures pain. The narrator's voice grows almost tender now, as if reciting an elegy. To suffer beautifully, it says, was to leave behind a trail of light. But beauty is not salvation. It is only the disguise pain wears when we are too afraid to look directly at it. The saint's calm, the scapegoat's scream both echo through history as proof of humanity's strange reverence for agony. We built our faith on it, our art from it, our empathy around it. Perhaps that is why their stories endure, because they remind us that pain, when remembered, becomes belonging. To be forgotten is the only true death. The wind rises in the narrator's memory. Bells toll faintly in the distance, as if calling both the holy and the damned to rest. In their shared silence, the boundary dissolves. The saint and the scapegoat become one symbols of the same fragile truth, that humanity's deepest need is not to punish, but to find meaning in what it cannot understand. And from their ashes, another story begins, not of individuals, but of entire civilizations that carry memory like a scar. From sainthood and silence, we turn now to the collective, to the ways in which cultures remember pain, and how, in remembering, they shape the very soul of the world. The morning streets of Europe are clean now. Cafes open, fountains whisper, and the pigeons claim the plazas before the tourists arrive. But beneath the hum of espresso machines and the laughter of children, the stones remember what the books forgot. They remember the sound of chains against cobblestone, the weight of silence before a sentence was read, the sharp rhythm of prayers muttered too late. Every step you take across these squares carries you through centuries of breath, some trembling, some fading into smoke. The past has not vanished, it has simply grown quieter. The narrator moves through these cities like one walking through layers of time. In Paris, where the guillotine once gleamed like an altar, lovers now sit on benches beneath trees, unaware that they occupy the same air once filled with the metallic scent of fear. In London, the tower stands serene against the river's silver surface, its grass trimmed neatly where heads once rolled. In Florence, the piazza glows beneath evening light, but if you listen closely, the wind still sounds like chanting, the echo of faith turned into fire. Each square tells a story without words. Its geometry remains unchanged, its proportions immaculate, as if designed to contain memory itself. The execution scaffold, the stake, the gallows all are gone, but the spaces they occupied have not forgotten their function. The symmetry that once guided punishment now guides tourists. The same sense of order that comforted the medieval mind still governs the eye. A perfect square, a perfect balance, a perfect illusion of peace. There is a strange tenderness to these places. The stones do not accuse, they simply endure. They have learned to carry horror without bitterness, to hold memory without judgment. Perhaps that is why we find them beautiful. They have absorbed everything, the cries, the sermons, the cheers, and distilled it into stillness. The plaza is the world's oldest listener. In the heart of Prague, beneath the astronomical clock, the narrator pauses. Here, time itself seems to turn like a wheel patient, impartial, endless. Centuries ago, heretics were hung from the same walls where tourists now take photographs. Their shadows once stretched across the cobblestones, where now shadows of bicycles fall. The clock continues its celestial dance, unmoved by the stories below. Yet, in its ticking, there lingers the faint pulse of those who are measured not by hours, but by judgment. Venice tells her stories in water. The canals that shimmer under moonlight once carried whispers of sentences pronounced in secret. The Bridge of Sighs still arches above the narrow channel, where prisoners caught their last glimpse of sky before vanishing into the Doge's dungeons. At sunset, the water glows gold, and for a moment, the reflection trembles like memory surfacing the faces of the condemned, returning briefly to watch the living drift past in gondolas, unaware of the silence beneath their laughter. In Madrid, the Plaza Mayor spreads like a sunlit wound. Musicians play, children chase pigeons, and every window is bright with movement. But in the stone beneath the performer's feet lies a history of fire, autos da fe, the rituals of the Inquisition, where sinners were cleansed through flame before crowds who believed they were witnessing salvation. The plaza's perfection is haunting, every arch symmetrical, every stone measured, order built upon ashes. The narrator walks through these cities in quiet reverence. The ghosts are not tragic, they are patient. They do not seek vengeance or pity. They exist simply to remind. Every civilization forgets differently, but none forget completely. The earth itself remembers the weight of each act. Even when the body is gone, the mark remains an indentation in the air, a vibration in the stone. In Nuremberg, where justice once turned into spectacle, the square feels strangely empty. The architecture stands as monument and apology. The stones underfoot seem polished not by time, but by repentance. Pigeons gather where crowds once roared approval at public executions. The air tastes faintly of dust and forgiveness. The narrator wonders if the city dreams of those it condemned if, when night falls, it whispers its regrets to the river. Each place holds its own kind of silence. Some are heavy, like cathedrals after prayer. Others are light, almost tender, as if forgiveness had finally settled like dust. In all of them, one senses the persistence of memory, not as guilt, but as echo. The stones do not distinguish between sinner and saint, between condemned and witness. They remember everyone equally. There is a peculiar beauty in this neutrality. The square, after all, is only a stage. It cannot choose its actors. What it holds is not sin, but story. The endless repetition of belief turned into action, of order struggling against fear. The people change, the costumes shift, but the geometry remains. Beneath the layers of paint, of pavement, of progress, the original stones wait, silent but alive, like the heartbeat of the world. Sometimes, at dusk, when the light softens and shadows lengthen, the past seems to surface again. The narrator describes standing in a square in Bruges, where the cobblestones glisten from a passing rain. The air smells of bread and damp earth. A musician plays a violin near the fountain, yet as the melody drifts through the air, another sound seems to join it, faint, rhythmic, almost human. It could be the wind, it could be footsteps, or it could be the memory of processions long gone, prisoners walking toward the scaffold, priests chanting, the crowd murmuring prayers. The square hums with both beauty and sorrow, its silence deeper than any tomb. It is easy to mistake peace for absence, but absence is never empty. It is filled with everything that once was. The narrator runs a hand along the wall of an old town hall, its surface cool and uneven. Beneath the skin of the stone, centuries whisper, the ink of decrees, the salt of tears, the soot of torches. To touch it is to feel the continuity of consequence, the way each generation leaves its fingerprint, then forgets. The stones remember what the books forgot. The narrator repeats softly, almost to herself. The phrase feels less like statement and more like confession. Perhaps that is why these squares remain sacred even after faith fades, because they are the only places honest enough to remember everything, both the cruelty and the grace. As the journey continues, the narrator senses a pattern emerging. Each city, no matter how distant, carries the same invisible architecture, a structure of memory beneath the facades of modernity. Streets become arteries of history, bridges become veins connecting centuries. The present walks lightly across the skin of the past, unaware of the pulse below. Night falls again. Lights bloom across the plazas like stars reflected on stone. The ghosts recede, but not entirely. They linger at the edges of perception in the echo of a closing door, in the faint scent of rain on stone. They do not haunt to frighten, but to remind. Every step is a conversation with those who came before. The narrator's tone lowers, a hush settling over the words like mist. Cities, she says, are not built of stone and mortar. They are built of memory and forgetting. One layer conceals the other. Every plaza is a page rewritten, but the ink beneath never truly fades. The listener can almost see it now, the invisible choreography of history moving through the modern streets, the shimmer of ancient echoes beneath the cobblestones. It is both haunting and comforting to know that nothing is ever fully lost. The past breathes quietly underfoot, patient as stone. From these silent streets, where ghosts linger without blame, the story turns inward from the memory of place to the memory of mind, into the hidden chambers of guilt and forgetting that every society and every soul must one day confront. The world remembers through silence as much as through story. Every civilization, like every person, learns the art of forgetting. It is not neglect, it is survival. We bury what we cannot bear to face, hoping the earth will keep our secrets. But what we erase does not vanish, it waits. For centuries, Europe carried its memories of fire and judgment like smouldering coals hidden under snow. The pyres, the dungeons, the cries all were covered by progress, by marble facades and polite philosophies. Yet beneath each cathedral square and courthouse corridor, the same faint warmth persists. Forgetting, it turns out, is not the opposite of remembering. It is its disguise. The narrator walks again through the old streets, those ghosted plazas where crowds once gathered to watch punishment become faith. Now, their descendants walk dogs, sip wine, post photographs. The stones no longer speak aloud, yet the silence feels thick, almost watchful. It is not peace, it is repression. civilization learned to polish its guilt until it shone like virtue. History, after all, is not written by memory but by comfort. The victors record, the uneasy erase. Each generation edits its conscience, trimming away the excess pain that might threaten pride. The medieval world buried its cruelty beneath holiness. The modern world buries it beneath progress. But the instinct is the same, to turn away from the reflection that reveals too much. There are entire centuries we describe as dark, not because of ignorance, but because we refuse to see ourselves in them. The dungeons, the witch trials, the inquisitions, these are framed as the failings of another age, as if cruelty obeyed calendars. We congratulate ourselves for leaving them behind, not realizing that our own prisons, our own silences, are their descendants. We have changed our methods, not our minds. Forgetfulness feels like healing. It allows societies to breathe again after horror. After wars, after purges, after public burnings, nations perform the same ritual. They rebuild, rename, reframe. They erect statues of heroes, not victims. They preserve architecture, not pain. They call it renewal. But each monument stands atop an unspoken absence. The missing, the erased, the unacknowledged. The narrator pauses by an old stone wall, its surface covered in ivy. Somewhere beneath that green veil, centuries of soot and blood sleep undisturbed. A tour guide nearby explains the site's architectural significance, but omits the executions that gave it meaning. The tourists nod, take photographs, and move on. The story has been polished to fit within comfort's frame. But the air remembers. It always does. The weight of forgetting is subtle. It does not crush, it lulls. It convinces us that silence equals peace, that distance equals redemption. Yet the unspoken lingers like static beneath civilization's music. The more we deny it, the deeper it sinks, transforming into superstition, prejudice, or quiet unease. The ghosts of the past are not angry because they were wronged. They are restless because they were erased. Every nation, every culture, carries its buried chambers. In France, the revolution replaced one terror with another. In Spain, the Inquisition's ashes mingled with the fires of empire. In England, witch trials dissolved into class prisons and workhouses. Each claimed enlightenment, each concealed continuity. The forms changed, the logic did not. Humanity learned to forget efficiently. The Church mastered the technique long before the state. When a saint's story became inconvenient, it was rewritten. When a heresy became too haunting, it was rebranded as myth. When punishment grew shameful, it was renamed ceremony. Forgetting became theology's twin, preserving purity through omission. Modernity merely adopted the practice, translating it into policy and decorum. And yet, the forgotten always return. They rise, not as ghosts but as questions. They haunt artists, historians, dreamers, those who listen to the quiet places of the world. Each rediscovery, each unsealed archive, each excavation of a forgotten cell reawakens what was meant to sleep forever. The more we learn, the more we realize how much was hidden. History, when studied honestly, is not a chronicle but a confession. The narrator's voice softens, drifting into reflection. What is guilt, she asks, if not memory that refuses to fade? Every age inherits the shame of the one before it. The punishments we refuse to name do not disappear. They seep into our foundations. They shape our language, our justice, our very concept of virtue. We believe ourselves civilized because we no longer see the spectacle of cruelty, yet cruelty thrives in subtler forms precisely because it hides behind our civility. Forgetting is not freedom. It is paralysis disguised as peace. The societies that claim to have transcended their pasts often carry them most completely. The medieval mind believed pain could purify the soul. The modern mind believes ignorance can purify the conscience. Both are illusions of cleansing, both are acts of denial. And still, forgetting is seductive. It allows the living to go on. After every atrocity, after every purge or war, there is a moment when the world collectively exhales and decides not to remember too clearly. That moment is understandable, even necessary. But when silence hardens into habit, when forgetting becomes identity, the cost grows unbearable. What is buried eventually demands resurrection. The narrator stands before a monument of marble angels, their faces serene, their wings outstretched, Beneath their feet lie the bones of those condemned centuries ago. The plaque names no victims. It speaks only of triumph of faith, of law, of renewal. It is not a lie, exactly. It is an omission, the kind the world prefers. There is a peculiar melancholy in this kind of forgetting. It is not cruelty, it is fatigue. Humanity cannot hold all its horrors at once. The mind closes doors for its own survival. Yet with each locked door, a little truth is lost, and with it, a little compassion. To forget suffering is to risk repeating it. To remember too vividly is to never heal. Between the two lies the fragile balance of wisdom, a space few societies ever reach. Sometimes, the earth itself remembers better than we do. Archaeologists unearth fragments, shackles fused with rust, scorched coins, splinters of scaffolds buried beneath gardens. These relics whisper softly of lives once erased. They remind us that history's soil is never neutral. It is made of dust, and dust is made of flesh. What we call progress is often built upon the ground of forgetting. The narrator imagines a future traveller walking these same streets centuries from now, seeing the ruins of our own institutions, our prisons, our screens, our systems of control. What will they think we tried to forget? Which cruelties will they find hidden behind our language of progress? What silences will they inherit from us? There is a quiet courage in remembering. It does not demand guilt, it demands honesty. To remember is to look into the mirror of our own contradictions, to see that the medieval and the modern are not opposites but reflections. We did not escape the age of faith. We merely traded its symbols for subtler ones. The rituals changed, the reasoning remained. The narrator's voice grows softer still, almost a whisper now. What we erase, she says, does not vanish. It waits. It waits in the pauses between history's words. It waits in the dreams of those who cannot sleep. It waits in the tremor that touches us when we stand in places too quiet for their age. The listener can feel it, that trembling beneath the calm, the realization that forgetting is not peace but postponement. The past waits for recognition, not revenge. Its ghosts do not seek retribution, only remembrance. They wish to be seen, to be named, to be understood. As the section closes, the narrator turns her gaze toward the horizon, toward those who will try to remember again. Historians, seekers, dreamers, and poets, the custodians of what survives forgetting. Their task will not be to punish, but to uncover, to translate silence back into story. And so, from memory and forgetting, the journey turns once more toward rediscovery, toward truth unearthed from centuries of dust. What was once hidden will speak again, not in accusation, but in quiet revelation. To uncover the past is to disturb the silence of the dead. In the quiet corridors of archives and museums, a new kind of pilgrimage unfolds, one not toward salvation but toward truth. The torches are replaced by screens, the monks by scholars, the quills by keyboards. Yet the spirit of the quest remains unchanged. Across Europe, in basements beneath libraries and vaults beneath cathedrals, men and women search for what was never meant to be found. They are the archaeologists of memory, unearthing the bones of stories buried by centuries of fear and faith. The narrator's voice carries a tone of reverence, as if describing an ancient ritual. Each discovery, no matter how small, feels like a resurrection, a forgotten ledger in a monastery attic, a cracked seal on a parchment that has not seen daylight since kings ruled, a set of iron shackles fused with rust, found beneath a marketplace where laughter now fills the air. These fragments do not simply belong to history. They are history, still breathing through dust and decay. In the archives of Bologna, a historian runs her gloved fingers across a faded manuscript labelled Acta Poenitentium, Records of the Penitent. Its pages, brittle and brown, contain the confessions of prisoners whose names were struck from every other record. Some lines are crossed out, others smudged beyond recognition. Yet even in erasure, the truth survives. One entry describes a woman punished for speaking to the wind. Another, a mason who shaped stones against divine order. The handwriting trembles, as though the scribe himself feared the words he wrote. Elsewhere, in the damp catacombs beneath Vienna, archaeologists uncover a chamber sealed since the 17th century. The walls bear carvings of crosses mixed with strange circular symbols, geometric prayers that seem to merge mathematics with mysticism. Alongside them, iron restraints, arranged deliberately, almost ritually, It is unclear whether this was a prison, a shrine, or something between. The scholars debate, but the stones remain ambiguous, refusing to confess fully. As one archaeologist whispers, "Every ruin lies." Each revelation blurs the boundaries between scholarship and seance. The researchers speak of data, context, and provenance, yet what they feel is something older, the presence of the forgotten, pressing close, asking to be remembered. The click of a camera shutter echoes like a heartbeat. The sound of pages turning resembles the slow breath of the dead. Knowledge, in this setting, feels sacred and dangerous all at once. In a digital laboratory in Paris, a team of archivists uses infrared imaging to read beneath centuries of censorship. They uncover layers of hidden text, erased sermons, redacted court records, overwritten confessions. Words once condemned as heresy emerge again in spectral light, glowing faintly on a screen. One line stands out among thousands. "Mercy is not for the innocent, but for those who cannot be." The archivist who reads it aloud feels the room grow colder. These are not just words, they are resurrections of voices deliberately silenced. The narrator lingers on the paradox. To study cruelty is to recreate it, if only in shadow. Each revelation demands empathy, yet also distance. The scholars must read about pain without feeling it too deeply, must classify what was once chaos. They handle chains, scorched relics, instruments of correction, but their task is not to condemn, it is to understand. And in that act of understanding, the past stirs again, uncertain whether to thank or accuse them. In the ruins of a monastery near Toledo, a researcher kneels among scattered stones. She holds a small iron spike, corroded but intact. Its tip is engraved with a single word, fiat, meaning, "let it be done." It once belonged to a device described only in rumour, an object built to enforce divine command. The discovery confirms that such a tool existed, but the manuscript describing its use has long vanished. The artifact speaks in silence, its shape a sentence that no translation can soften. Elsewhere, underwater archaeologists map the remains of medieval punishment, ships sunk along northern coasts, floating prisons used during times of famine and heresy. The vessels lie like sleeping beasts beneath the waves, their timbers encrusted with coral. As the divers move through the darkness, their lights reveal faint carvings on the hulls, tally marks, prayers, fragments of psalms. One plank bears the phrase, "Remember us." The ocean has preserved what history wished to drown. Every discovery challenges the neatness of modern morality. We like to believe the past was cruel, and we are enlightened. But as these fragments surface, they reveal how little we have changed, how the machinery of control endures, polished but familiar. The Inquisitor's scroll becomes the bureaucrat's form. The iron key becomes a password. The dungeon becomes a database. The means evolve, but the logic remains. The narrator reflects softly. To uncover the past is to disturb the silence of the dead, but it is also to disturb the comfort of the living. For every artifact unearthed, there is a question the present must answer. Why were these acts forgotten? Who decided that cruelty should vanish from memory? And what does it mean that we now bring them back, photographing them, exhibiting them, turning them once more into spectacle not of punishment, but of curiosity? There is a strange irony in this resurrection. Once, suffering was public, designed to instruct the masses. Now, its memory is displayed under glass, explained through plaques and commentary. The same fascination remains, softened by distance. Tourists photograph the very instruments that once terrified their ancestors, capturing them as art, as education, as proof that progress exists. The world believes it has transcended cruelty, because it can now admire it aesthetically. Yet the unease persists. The quiet knowledge that fascination is a form of complicity. In a university lab in Cambridge, a historian uses artificial intelligence to reconstruct lost trial records. The algorithm fills gaps where text has been destroyed, predicting phrases through patterns in surviving manuscripts. It produces sentences that no human has written in centuries. Reading them feels uncanny, as if the machine, in its unfeeling precision, has become a modern scribe for the dead. The past, filtered through circuits, speaks once more. It whispers of punishment and mercy, of sin and order, its words both ancient and eerily familiar. To study the past is to trespass into the sacred ground of forgetting. Every new discovery carries moral weight. Each unearthed confession, each decoded fragment, demands an answer. What will we do with this knowledge? Remembering is an act of resurrection, but resurrection, in every myth, comes with consequence. The narrator's tone deepens, the calm tinged with awe. We think of history as something we hold, she says, but history also holds us. It decides what we inherit, what we repeat, what we pretend to outgrow. The modern scholars, with their satellites and scanners, are not just uncovering ruins. They are unearthing the continuity of belief, the persistence of the same patterns that built the gallows, the wheel, the cell. In one final image, the narrator describes a museum exhibit in Berlin, a glass case containing a single rusted shackle beside a digital tablet that reconstructs its origin. Visitors watch the animation, the tool reborn in light, its motion simulated, its function explained. Children press their faces to the glass. Adults stand quietly, unsure whether to feel sorrow or fascination. In that hesitation lies the true meaning of rediscovery, the moment when the past looks back and asks, "What will you forget next?" The light fades on the exhibit. The narrator's voice falls to a whisper. The silence of centuries has been disturbed, and in that trembling stillness, something long buried begins to breathe again. The story turns now from discovery to reflection, to what these resurrected truths reveal about us, about the unbroken thread of justice and control that binds every age to its own idea of righteousness. The stage has changed, the punishment has not. The scaffold is gone, the gallows dismantled, the stake turned to ash, yet the ritual continues, alive in new arenas. We no longer gather in plazas to watch the condemned suffer. We gather instead in digital squares, glowing with the light of screens. The crowd is vast, invisible, and always present. Judgment no longer smells of smoke. It hums in silence, in pixels, in words that spread faster than any whisper could travel through medieval air. The narrator's voice is calm, almost sorrowful. "We tell ourselves we are civilized," she begins, "but civilization has merely refined cruelty into spectacle. The same instincts that filled town squares now pulse through social networks. We still gather for the ceremony of outrage, still watch as a single soul is lifted high for correction, confession, and destruction. The costumes are different, no robes, no torches, but the rhythm of the ritual remains unchanged. The medieval mind believed punishment purified the soul. The modern mind believes exposure purifies the world. We call it accountability, justice, transparency. And yet, beneath those noble words lies the same hunger that once drew peasants and nobles alike to the square. The hunger to see another fall, so that we might feel safe, righteous, clean. It is not blood we crave now, but submission. Not the body's agony, but the humiliation of confession. In the digital square, the condemned are not bound by ropes, but by memory. Their words, once spoken, never vanish. Their mistakes replay endlessly, shared and reshared like relics of sin. Each retweet, each comment, each thread becomes a pebble in a public stoning. No one wields the weapon, yet everyone participates. The crowd's faces are unseen, its voice a chorus of virtue. "We do not torture," the world says proudly, but the outcome, isolation, despair, erasure, feels hauntingly familiar. Once, a priest demanded confession. Now, we demand apology. Once, a crowd awaited the sinner's remorse. Now, we scroll, searching for sincerity, measuring tone, debating whether the sinner has repented enough. The ritual is interactive, participatory, a democracy of punishment. The condemned kneel before the algorithm instead of the altar, hoping for mercy that never truly comes. There is something mesmerizing about it, this choreography of condemnation. It unfolds with precision. The discovery, the exposure, the outrage, the penance, the forgetting. Each step as predictable as the toll of church bells on execution day. The crowd gathers not from cruelty alone, but from a strange longing for order, for proof that the moral fabric still holds. Every downfall reassures us that justice still exists, that wickedness will not go unanswered. We believe we are defending truth, but perhaps we are merely feeding an ancient instinct disguised as virtue. The narrator pauses, allowing the silence to settle. "We used to burn bodies," she says softly. Now we burn reputations. The fire is slower, but it leaves the same kind of ash. This new theatre of morality has no boundaries, no closing ceremony. The medieval executioner performed his duty, then washed his hands. The modern crowd never leaves the stage. Outrage is infinite, constantly renewed. The condemned, once punished, never truly return to life. Their names linger in the archives of search results, preserved forever in the amber of memory. The digital pyre burns without flame, and its smoke rises into the collective conscience, unnoticed but ever present. Even those who do not join the crowd feel its pull. The fear of judgment shapes our behaviour, just as the threat of the stocks once shaped villagers' obedience. We moderate our speech, curate our virtue, perform our decency. It is not faith that controls us now, but perception. We have traded one form of salvation for another moral purity achieved through visibility. Be seen as good, the culture whispers, or risk being seen at all. The tools have evolved, but the structure is ancient. Consider the medieval shaming post, where offenders were tied for mockery. Its purpose was less about justice and more about purification through public scorn. Today, that same logic unfolds on screens. The crowd mocks not with stones or rotten fruit, but with words, sharp, clever, righteous words that pierce deeper than iron. And like the villagers who once laughed at the condemned, we tell ourselves it is deserved. There is comfort in punishment. It creates boundaries, reaffirms belonging. To witness another's downfall is to be momentarily reassured that we ourselves are safe. The crowd feels pure because someone else is burning. The ritual never needed cruelty to survive, only participation. And participation, in the digital age, is effortless. A click, a comment, a silence. The modern world perfected punishment by making it convenient. Even the language echoes the past. We speak of trials, verdicts, witch hunts. We talk of cancelling, as though erasure were mercy. The metaphors betray the lineage. Beneath the layers of technology and enlightenment lies the same medieval heart, one that seeks order through exclusion, meaning through sacrifice. Every public humiliation is a sermon, every downfall a moral lesson. The crowd does not gather to destroy, but to confirm that it still believes in right and wrong. The narrator reflects on this with quiet gravity. We no longer believe in hell, she says, so we build it here not underground, but online. The condemned wander through it endlessly, reliving their crimes through algorithms that refuse forgiveness. The system demands engagement, not redemption. And so the sinner remains visible forever, their pain recycled for profit and entertainment. Yet amid this darkness, there is a peculiar tenderness too, the echo of something human. We punish not only to destroy, but to belong. Outrage unites us. It gives shape to our shared fears. When the world feels chaotic, punishment becomes ritual stability. Each scandal is a miniature exorcism, purging the collective of anxiety. We do not burn witches anymore, but we still need them. They hold our shadows so we do not have to. The narrator's tone turns reflective, almost mournful. Perhaps that is why cruelty endures, she muses. Because it is easier to punish than to understand. Easier to destroy what frightens us than to face it within ourselves. The medieval executioner believed he was cleansing the world of sin. The modern commentator believes he is cleansing it of corruption. Both perform their duties with conviction. Both act in the name of justice. Both fear what might happen if they stop. There is a cruel beauty in how history repeats itself, never identically, always poetically. The old tools rust, the old rituals fade, but the essence remains. The need to draw a circle around virtue and cast someone beyond its edge. Progress, it seems, has not erased the scaffold but digitized it. The fire burns cooler, the crowds chant quieter, but the structure endures, elegant and efficient. Still, awareness is its own kind of rebellion. To see the pattern is to loosen its hold. Perhaps that is the beginning of mercy, not in abolishing punishment, but in understanding its roots. The narrator wonders whether humanity could ever create a justice that does not depend on humiliation, a morality that does not demand spectacle. It is an ancient question, unanswered still. As the section draws to a close, the narrator's voice softens, almost like a lullaby. The stage has changed, yes, but the story remains. We seek purity through pain, truth through exposure, safety through shame. And though the tools glow brighter, The heart behind them still flickers with the same old fire. She pauses, as though standing at the edge of time itself, gazing at the reflection of centuries merged into one. The medieval square and the digital feed overlap in her mind, both illuminated, both alive with judgment. The sound of a crowd, distant yet familiar, rises and fades. And then, in the stillness that follows, she offers a final thought. Every age builds its own theatre of punishment. What changes is not the cruelty, only the applause. From this reflection, the story begins to lift its gaze higher. Beyond cruelty, beyond control, toward revelation, the deeper truth of why humanity punishes at all, and what these rituals reveal about the fragile, yearning soul that seeks meaning in suffering. Every punishment tells the same story, our fear of chaos. Across centuries, beneath different names and languages, the same impulse endures, to impose meaning upon fear. The whip, the fire, the prison, the silence, all instruments of the same belief that order can be restored by inflicting pain. Punishment, at its core, is not about justice but about control. A mirror we hold up to the shadows within ourselves, convincing us that we are separate from what we condemn. The narrator's voice drifts like smoke, slow, meditative, almost kind. Cruelty, she begins, is not born from hatred. It is born from fear, the fear that without control, the world will dissolve into chaos. The medieval mind expressed that fear through divine law, the modern one through social order. Both systems, different in form, identical in essence. They exist to protect us not only from others, but from ourselves, from the parts of our nature we dare not name. When a crowd gathers to witness punishment, it is not merely justice they seek, but reassurance. They see their own doubt transformed into certainty, their own weakness mirrored in the condemned. The spectacle is a ceremony of projection. To see another suffer is to believe that evil has a shape, that it can be contained, burned, erased. But the truth, the narrator whispers, is gentler and more terrifying. The cruelty we inflict on others is merely the reflection of what we fear within. Even the most devout executioner once trembled before his task. Chronicles tell of men who prayed for forgiveness before lifting the blade, their tears falling silently into the dust. They were not monsters, but reflections of the world that created them, instruments of a collective need for purity. Each act of punishment was a prayer for order, a desperate plea to the universe. Make this make sense. Let this pain restore balance. We have always feared disorder more than suffering. The world feels safe when pain has purpose, when wrong has consequence. The cruelest punishments, therefore, are not accidents. They are the architecture of fear, built from the conviction that suffering can heal the wound of uncertainty. To punish is to believe that pain cleanses, that it draws a line between good and evil, between us and them. But no such line exists. There is only the endless mirror, reflecting cruelty back through time. The narrator's tone softens further. We are creatures of reflection, she says. We learn who we are by what we reject. Every society defines itself through its enemies, heretics, criminals, sinners, dissidents. Without them, identity blurs. Perhaps that is why cruelty feels sacred. It preserves boundaries, gives shape to morality. When we punish, we draw the border between civilization and chaos, between faith and doubt, between belonging and exile. In this light, punishment becomes a ritual of reassurance. It does not prevent sin, it defines it. It transforms fear into structure. The medieval scaffold and the modern courtroom serve the same symbolic function. They reaffirm the illusion that the world is just, that consequence aligns with morality, that we can measure guilt by decree. Cruelty is the scaffolding of comfort, ugly, necessary, endlessly rebuilt. And yet, each act of punishment betrays its own fragility. The more a society punishes, the more it reveals its insecurity. Excessive cruelty is not strength but panic, an attempt to silence the whisper that control is impossible. The medieval church burned heretics not because it was certain, but because it was terrified of doubt. Modern institutions imprison and isolate not from power, but from fear of the unpredictable human heart. The greater the fear, the harsher the justice. Every punishment, the narrator continues, is a confession not of the condemned, but of the society that condemns. Through cruelty, we reveal what we cannot face. The wheel, the rack, the scaffold, all were monuments to human anxiety. Even now, Our invisible systems of control, our subtle shaming, our rituals of exposure, all declare the same secret: that order is fragile, and that we depend on punishment to believe it can endure. To look into this mirror honestly is uncomfortable. It means admitting that cruelty has purpose, and that purpose is us. The history of punishment is not a story of monsters, but of mirrors countless generations reflecting their own fears back upon others. The executioner's torch, the judge's gavel, the critic's outrage, all guided by the same trembling hand seeking to define what cannot be controlled: human nature itself. The narrator pauses, as if to let the listener breathe. The silence feels full, heavy with understanding. If we look deeply enough, she says, we see that every cruelty was once an act of faith. Not faith in God necessarily, but faith in structure, in the belief that the world can be tidied through suffering. It is a kind of optimism, dark, distorted, but sincere. The medieval priest believed the soul could be saved through fire. The modern reformer believes society can be purified through exposure. Both kneel before the same altar, the altar of order. This realization softens judgment. It reveals that cruelty, while unforgivable, is also deeply human, a byproduct of the same yearning that gives rise to art, faith, and love: the desire to make sense of what terrifies us. To punish is to try to draw boundaries around the infinite. To forgive is to accept that those boundaries never truly existed. The mirror of cruelty, once understood, becomes something else, not a condemnation, but a map. It shows where fear has lived, where control has failed, where compassion has been replaced by law. Every reflection invites understanding: how the church's fires mirror our own systems of moral exile, how the stocks and the scaffold echo in our modern desire for public reckoning. Cruelty is not a relic of the past. It is a language humanity still speaks, often without knowing it. And yet, awareness carries hope. The narrator's voice grows warmer, almost luminous. When we see cruelty as reflection, she says, we begin to loosen its hold. We stop mistaking punishment for peace. We begin to understand that control is not safety, and that order built on fear is only another form of chaos. This is not forgiveness, yet only recognition, the quiet prelude to wisdom. The world, viewed through this lens, becomes tender again. The medieval crowd, the modern mob, the judge, the accused, all are actors in the same play, bound by the same longing, to believe that justice can heal what fear has broken. To see this truth is not to excuse cruelty, but to understand it, and through understanding, to outgrow it. The narrator ends the section with a tone of calm revelation. Every punishment, she whispers, is a mirror polished by time. It shows us not who they were, but who we are. Frightened creatures, building altars to control what cannot be controlled. And yet, in that reflection lies our chance for grace. From this understanding that cruelty is the echo of fear, the story moves toward its final meditation: transcendence. The age-old cycle of sin and suffering begins to fade, giving way to forgiveness not of deeds, but of history itself. For only in forgiving the past can humanity finally step out of its reflection and into the light beyond judgment. When we forgive the past, we awaken from it. The final movement of the story begins in silence, the kind that feels like breath after confession. The centuries of fire and fear have burned themselves out, leaving only ash and light. The narrator's voice softens, less historian now than witness, speaking from a place beyond judgment. What remains, she says, is not cruelty or guilt, but understanding. And understanding, at last, is mercy. Human history, when viewed from a distance, resembles a long exhalation, pain releasing itself through time. Every age has believed itself righteous. Every age has punished to preserve that righteousness. Yet each in turn has been judged by the next. The wheel turns, endlessly. What was once justice becomes shame. What was once cruelty becomes lesson. The pattern is both humbling and beautiful. Our errors are the soil in which conscience grows. The narrator lingers on this idea, as if tracing the rhythm of centuries with her voice. To remember cruelty without anger, she says, is to reclaim it from its purpose. Pain, once seen clearly, loses its power to wound. It becomes wisdom, the still water left behind after the flood. This is not forgetting, it is transformation. Memory ceases to accuse and begins to teach. The medieval punishments, the iron, the fire, the silence no longer feel barbaric now, but human. They were the instruments of a species learning morality by trial and error, searching for order in a world it barely understood. The inquisitor and the condemned, the saint and the scapegoat, were all part of the same lesson, that suffering cannot create peace, only the illusion of it. But by remembering their mistakes, we draw closer to truth that mercy, not control, is the final shape of wisdom. In this calm reflection, the narrator walks once more through the ruins of Europe, now bathed in dawn. The same squares that once echoed with screams are filled with birdsong. The same cathedrals that once judged now glow with quiet light through stained glass. The past has not disappeared. It has softened, integrated into beauty. Even the stones seem lighter, as though forgiveness itself has weight, and that weight has finally been lifted. She pauses before a wall, old, cracked, covered in ivy. Once, it may have enclosed a prison yard or supported a scaffold. Now, it supports flowers. This, she says, is what history does when left in peace. It transforms wounds into roots. Every cruelty eventually becomes part of the world's foundation, not to be repeated, but to be remembered with gentleness. The world forgives itself through time. To forgive the past is not to excuse it. Forgiveness in this sense is not absolution, it is awakening. When we forgive, we stop fighting ghosts. We let history breathe. We recognize that cruelty was not an aberration but a symptom of fear, and that fear, too, is human. To see that is to free ourselves from it. We cannot change what was done, but we can decide what it means. The narrator's voice is like candlelight, now low, warm, flickering. Every soul that suffered, she says, contributed to the birth of compassion. Every scream became a note in the hymn of conscience. Humanity's progress is not measured by the cruelty it invents, but by the empathy that eventually rises from its ashes. The wheel of pain turns into the circle of understanding. The same energy that once built dungeons now builds hospitals, sanctuaries, shelters. The same hands that once wielded whips now write laws, create art, cradle children. Mercy is not a gift of enlightenment. It is the natural conclusion of fatigue. When cruelty exhausts itself, what remains is tenderness. The narrator describes this not as an achievement, but as an inevitability, the slow evolution of the human heart. In time, she whispers, the need to punish fades, replaced by the wish to heal. Justice matures into empathy, law into wisdom, fear into patience. It is as though the world itself learns. The earth, which once soaked up blood, now nourishes life. The air that once carried screams now carries songs. Even time seems to have mercy, eroding monuments of judgment until they become quiet stones by the roadside reminders, not warnings. Yet mercy, the narrator insists, is not forgetting. It is remembering differently. It is looking upon the scaffold, the rack, the dungeon, and seeing not monsters, but people all trying, in their own flawed way, to make sense of existence. To forgive history is to understand that its cruelty was the shadow cast by its innocence. Humanity was not evil. It was young. In this recognition lies peace. The heart that sees cruelty and does not turn away, that heart becomes capable of mercy. Not pity, not superiority, but quiet understanding. They did what they thought was right. And we do too. And we too will be judged. The cycle continues, but the awareness of it softens the edges. Each generation carries the potential to act with a little more grace, a little less fear. The narrator's reflection turns inward, almost prayerful. What if, she asks, every punishment ever given, every pain ever endured, was part of a vast conversation between the soul and time, a dialogue through which the universe learns compassion? In that view, even cruelty becomes a teacher, and mercy, its final lesson. Every civilization leaves behind both scars and wisdom. The scars remind us of what we were. The wisdom shows what we may become. Mercy, then, is not passive. It is active remembrance, the courage to look at horror and say, I see you, and I understand. It is the act of refusing to repeat the past's blindness. It transforms justice from vengeance into comprehension, from control into care. It is, in essence, the final stage of consciousness, the point where knowledge turns into peace. The narrator walks along the edge of a river. The surface reflects the sky perfectly, yet beneath the calm, the water moves, carrying fragments of leaves, of light, of time. This, she says, is how mercy works. It does not erase what was, but carries it forward, gently, until it becomes part of everything else. In the stillness that follows, her voice almost dissolves into the sound of wind. When we forgive the past, we awaken from it, she repeats. We stop living inside its shadow. We see that punishment was never justice, only fear given form. And we see too that mercy is not weakness. It is the quiet strength that allows the world to continue. There is an image now of humanity standing at the edge of its own reflection, gazing into the waters of history. The surface is no longer dark. It glows faintly, illuminated by understanding. Beneath it lies everything we have ever done, the cruelty, the courage, the confusion, yet above it, the sky remains endless. Forgiveness, the narrator suggests, is not about choosing light over darkness, but realizing that both are part of the same horizon. The world that once punished in God's name, that once shamed in reason's name, now begins to understand that the truest justice is compassion. Mercy is not an escape from responsibility, it is its fulfillment. To forgive the past is to integrate it, to bring shadow and light into balance, to end the ancient war between purity and imperfection. The voice grows softer still, as if addressing the listener personally now. And you, it says, you are part of this story. Every time you choose understanding over anger, you change what history becomes. Every act of patience, every moment of empathy, is a correction written not in ink, but in time. The soundscape fades, distant bells, rustling wind, a slow heartbeat of earth. The narrator continues, the past no longer needs to be buried or feared, it only needs to be seen. For in being seen, it rests. And so the story, which began with fire and ended in quiet, closes its circle. The punishments, the prayers, the fear, the faith, all dissolve into a single realization that mercy is the truest legacy of suffering. Not as forgiveness for the unforgivable, but as understanding that nothing human is beyond redemption. The narrator's final words fall like evening light. The world was cruel because it was afraid. The world will be kind because it remembers. From here, the journey nears its end, a farewell not only to history, but to the fear that shaped it. What remains is peace. The soft, eternal silence after confession, a silence that does not forget but forgives. When the last bell fell silent, so did 1,000 years of belief. The story begins at dusk. The year is fading, and with it, an age. In a small European town, nameless now, swallowed by centuries, the final executioner walks home after his last duty. His steps are slow, unhurried. The square behind him is empty, swept clean by the wind. The scaffold still stands, its timbers dark with rain, but no one gathers there anymore. The crowd has gone, the prayers have ended, and for the first time in his life, he feels what he cannot name a world without purpose for the hands that once held the blade. The narrator's voice is soft, tender, almost like a lullaby. He is not a monster, she says. He is a man of his time, one who believed he served order, that pain could keep the world from falling apart. His trade was not cruelty, but duty. His rituals were not of hate, but of law. He was the quiet servant of fear, the necessary shadow of belief. Now that belief is dying, he walks as if following a ghost, the ghost of everything he once understood. His home lies beyond the town, near the edge of a forest. The road is muddy, the evening air damp with the scent of smoke and pine. He carries his tools in a worn cloth bag, an axe, polished though never gleaming, and a length of rope, frayed but neatly coiled. They are heavy, not from their weight, but from memory. For years, they defined him symbols of justice, symbols of sin. But now, with the world changing, they are only relics. As he walks, the bells of the church ring faintly behind him, not for death, but for vespers. Their sound drifts through the fog like a prayer for the forgotten. He pauses, listening. The tone is softer than he remembers. Perhaps, he thinks, even the bells have grown tired of mourning. He reaches a bridge where the river glides beneath, dark and slow. The reflection of the town's spire trembles on the water, a wavering image of faith losing its shape. The executioner leans on the railing, his breath visible in the chill air. He does not think of the faces he has seen or the cries he has heard. He thinks only of silence, how it feels unfamiliar, like a language he must now learn. The narrator describes his thoughts as though they are drifting leaves. All his life, she says, he believed he was necessary, that without punishment, the world would collapse. That order was a fragile light, kept alive by obedience and fear. Yet as he looks toward the town, its windows warm and glowing, he realizes something unexpected. The world has not ended. Children still laugh, smoke still curls from chimneys, the river still runs. Justice has changed its form, but life continues, untroubled by his absence. There is peace in this realization, and also sorrow. He has spent a lifetime perfecting a craft that no one will need again. The knowledge passed down from his father and his father's father will vanish with him. The blade will dull, the rope will rot, and his name will fade like a candle's smoke. Yet, as he stands there, he feels no bitterness, only relief. For perhaps it was never the condemned who needed release, but him. He continues walking, deeper into the quiet fields where mist gathers over the grass. The air feels softer now, touched by the scent of rain. He imagines that every drop washing from the sky carries away a trace of what came before: the fear, the guilt, the noise of judgment. The world is rinsing itself clean. For centuries, pain was prayer, and the executioner, its priest. Now, even prayer has changed. The narrator's voice becomes stiller, almost like the voice of time itself. He was the last of his kind, she says. After him, punishment would move indoors, quieter, hidden, bureaucratic. The spectacle would end, but the idea would linger. He does not know this, of course. He knows only the simplicity of what he feels, the world growing larger, his place in it smaller. Yet there is beauty in that smallness, like a candle realizing it no longer needs to burn. The forest ahead is dark, but not threatening. The trees arch above him, their branches heavy with mist. He walks beneath them, listening to the creak of wood and the rustle of leaves. Each sound feels ancient, patient, as though the forest has been waiting for this moment, when silence would finally reclaim what centuries of noise had taken. The path narrows, winding toward his cottage, a modest place of stone and thatch. Smoke curls from the chimney, faint and blue. Inside, the hearth is cold, but he lights it carefully, methodically, the way one prepares a ritual. The fire catches slowly, illuminating the tools he sets beside it. He wipes the axe clean, coils the rope one final time, and lays them on the table. The gesture feels ceremonial, an ending disguised as habit. He looks at them, not with guilt, but gratitude. They gave him a life, a purpose, a place in the order of things. And now, like him, they are ready to rest. He sits by the fire, listening to the quiet crackle of wood. Outside, the night deepens. Somewhere far off, an owl calls. He closes his eyes and thinks of the faces he once feared, to remember not as victims or sinners, but as people. A farmer, a thief, a heretic, a mother. All of them, in some way, mirrors of himself trying to survive the rules of their time. The line between punisher and punished blurs, until it disappears entirely. The narrator speaks softly. He sees, at last, that every act of cruelty was an act of belief, and that belief, when outgrown, must dissolve. In his stillness, he senses the weight of centuries lifting, like fog rising from a field. He realizes that mercy has already begun, not as a decree from above, but as a quiet understanding within. The world no longer needs executioners because it has learned, in some small way, to forgive itself. The fire burns lower. The light wavers on the walls. The executioner leans back, his hands resting on his knees. Outside, the bells ring one last time, their echo faint but clear. They sound not like mourning, but release a farewell to an age, a benediction for what comes next. He rises, walks to the door, and opens it. The night air is cool and gentle, filled with the scent of rain. The clouds part slightly, revealing a sky full of stars. He stands there for a long time, watching them. The constellations have not changed. They have seen empires rise and vanish, faiths burn and rekindle. Their light is older than any law, softer than any sentence. He thinks for the first time that perhaps no one ever deserved punishment, that all cruelty was just confusion seeking meaning. The thought feels weightless, like forgiveness taking form. He smiles, faintly, almost imperceptibly, and steps outside. The narrator's voice lowers to a whisper. "And so," she says, "the last executioner walked into history not as a man of death, but as its witness. The world did not notice his passing, but in that unnoticed silence, 1,000 years of belief finally came to rest. The camera of imagination widens, the town asleep, the river gleaming, the forest breathing. The scaffold stands empty under the stars, its ropes swaying gently in the wind. In the distance, a cock crows not for dawn, but for rebirth. And as the fire in his cottage fades to embers, the story itself exhales. The sound of footsteps fades into stillness, the kind that belongs to endings. From that silence, the silence of the last executioner, the silence of an era the story prepares to enter its final meditation, the closing farewell to the forgotten world, and to the long shadow it finally learned to forgive. Perhaps history never ends, it only sleeps between our footsteps. The voice of the narrator returns like the last ember of a fire, slow, warm, and low. The story has walked across centuries, through shadow and flame, and now arrives at stillness. The tone is no longer that of inquiry or revelation, but of rest. Every age that burned, every belief that broke, every voice that once cried for mercy now settles into the quiet rhythm of memory. What was chaos becomes pattern, what was punishment becomes story, and story, at last, becomes peace. The listener can almost hear it, the faint hum beneath the world, like a sleeper's breath. The earth itself seems to dream, holding within its soil the soft pulse of all that has been. Beneath our cities lie the bones of saints and sinners, kings and peasants, victims and executioners. Yet in that shared sleep, the divisions vanish. Time, the great equalizer, folds their differences into silence. There is no judgment left, only continuation, the steady heartbeat of existence turning endlessly beneath the ground. The narrator speaks gently. To live is to forget. To remember is to live again. History moves between the two, breathing in and out, like the tides. Each generation wakes to find the world new, yet shaped by dreams it does not recall. The rituals of the past, the fires, the confessions, the sentences, lie dormant, waiting to be reinterpreted. Even cruelty, once stripped of purpose, becomes a teacher. Pain transformed into perspective. Above ground, life continues its quiet miracle. Streets hum with voices, towers reach toward the sky, and the same wind that once fanned the flames of pyres now carries the scent of bread, of rain, of peace. The world has not forgotten its darkness. It has learned to live with it, to weave it into light. This, the narrator suggests, is the true sleep of history, not absence, but transformation. Memory does not die, it ripens. She pauses, and the air seems to hold its breath. Some say time is a line, she whispers, but perhaps it is a circle, not of repetition, but of renewal. The listener can feel the truth of it. Each cruelty, once unlearned, returns as kindness. Each judgment, once exhausted, gives way to understanding. Every age mistakes itself for the end, yet it is always only a turning, the slow rotation of conscience beneath the stars. The narrator walks again in imagination through those familiar places, the silent squares, the worn cathedrals, the rivers that once reflected gallows and now reflect the moon. Nothing has vanished. Everything endures, softened by mercy. The scaffold's wood became soil, the soil grew flowers, the flowers fed the living. In this endless exchange, the world redeems itself, not through forgiveness alone, but through the quiet work of time. And perhaps that is the final secret, that history is not something we leave behind, but something that sleeps within us. Every act of compassion is a correction written in its dream. Every cruelty repeated is its nightmare stirring again. We inherit not only what people built, but what they believed, what they feared, what they longed for. We are the continuation of their unfinished prayers. The narrator's tone turns reflective, almost tender. We are the children of the past's mercy, she says. Its cruelties shaped us, but its mercies sustain us. The listener senses that the story is no longer about punishment, or even about history, but about the quiet endurance of the human spirit. How? Despite everything, it keeps trying to be kind. In the stillness that follows, She describes the passage of time as a kind of sleepwalk, the world drifting through centuries, dreaming itself awake. Kingdoms rise and fall like breaths. Ideas bloom, wither, and return. Faith changes its name, but not its yearning. Even the stars, which seem eternal, are only part of this slow cycle of creation and rest. The universe itself, she says, may be dreaming, and we are its thoughts, flickering between awareness and forgetting. Perhaps, she continues softly, the reason we study history is not to awaken it, but to learn how to sleep within it peacefully, consciously, without fear. To remember cruelty without reliving it, to hold darkness without letting it consume the light. This is the gentle art of wisdom. Just as the body cannot live without rest, the mind cannot endure without forgiveness. To forgive the past is to let it rest. To understand it is to let it dream. The imagery turns almost musical now, like a lullaby woven from centuries. The bells that once tolled for death now sound like heartbeats. The rivers that once carried ashes now shimmer with reflection. The old tools of pain, iron, rope, fire have become artifacts of learning. Even silence, once heavy with fear, has become a place of peace. The listener can feel the world exhaling, the long ache of history easing into calm. The narrator's voice lowers to a whisper. There is mercy beyond time, she says. It does not erase what was, but it softens it, like snow falling over ruins, like sleep over sorrow. This mercy does not belong to gods or kings. It belongs to time itself, patient, impartial, infinite. Every cruelty is eventually outgrown. Every wound becomes part of the body's story, not its definition. In this way, humanity heals not by forgetting, but by transforming memory into meaning. Outside the story, the listener might imagine the night deepening. The world grows still. The sounds of civilization fade until only the faint rustle of wind remains the eternal whisper of time passing. Listen, the narrator murmurs. That sound beneath everything that is history sleeping. She describes how even the earth seems to sigh in its rest. The mountains once formed by violence now stand serene. The oceans that swallowed cities now glitter under the same stars that watched them drown. Nothing is lost. Nothing is erased. The world, in its vast patience, keeps every memory not as burden, but as balance. The scene shifts once more to the image of the last executioner's empty cottage, its fire long gone cold. Outside, the forest grows thick with life. The scaffold has collapsed into the soil, its remains now part of the roots. In the distance, the church bell cracked, forgotten tolls once in the wind, not as warning, but as lullaby. The centuries fold themselves into stillness. The story, too, begins to drift. The narrator's tone becomes softer, slower, each word a gentle step toward silence. Perhaps, she says, every age ends not with a cry, but with a sigh. Not with a final judgment, but with understanding. The world grows tired, then begins again. The listener can almost feel the warmth of that idea that nothing truly ends, not even history. It only changes form, waiting to be remembered again in some future dawn. Then, after a long pause, she continues. The past sleeps beneath us, not buried, but dreaming. It remembers us even as we forget it. Its breath is the wind. Its heartbeat, the rhythm of our own. The narrator lets that thought linger, the words fading into a silence so deep it feels alive. The air seems to shimmer with peace, not absence, but presence. The quiet awareness that everything is still connected. The living and the dead, the remembered and the lost, the judged and the forgiven. Slowly, she offers her final reflection, a voice almost dissolving into air. We walk upon the dreams of those who came before us. Each step wakes them for a moment, then lets them rest again. And if we listen closely, the earth itself whispers mercy, reminding us that history never ends. It only sleeps, waiting for our kindness to call it gently awake. The final sound is not words, but breath, a long exhale, like the closing of a chapter too vast for language. The screen fades to darkness. The voice, barely audible now, drifts one last time across the quiet. Sleep well. The past is at peace. And with that, the story and the listener finally rests.